Pull up a map of the Western Pacific and find a 12-mile-long flat island sitting 3 miles south of Saipan. In the summer of 1944, it holds roughly 9,000 Japanese soldiers, 2 partially built airfields, and fields of sugarcane covering coral ground that neither side yet fully understands the value of. By the summer of 1945, that same island runs 6 runways, each stretching 8,500 feet across flattened coral, parks hundreds of B-29 superfortresses weighing 135,000 pounds fully loaded, and stores aviation fuel measured in tens of thousands of tons underground. The island is Tinian, and the story of how it goes from defended Japanese territory to the most consequential bomber base in human history begins with one of the most coldly calculated amphibious deceptions of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese garrison defending Tinian in July 1944 concentrates its heaviest defenses at the obvious landing point, Tinian Town Beach on the southwestern coast, roughly 600 yards wide and pre-registered by artillery batteries firing shells heavier than 75 millimeters. The Americans study the same geography and choose 2 beaches on the northwestern coast instead. White Beach 1 measures 60 yards across. White Beach 2 measures 160 yards. Together, they are barely wide enough to land 2 battalions simultaneously, which, by conventional amphibious doctrine, makes them inadequate for a divisional assault, and by the logic of surprise, makes them exactly right. While American landing craft circle off Tinian Town on July 24, 1944, in a feint that draws Japanese artillery fire and expends their ammunition against a landing that never materializes, 15,000 Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions hit the northwest beaches against minimal initial resistance. The deception costs almost nothing. The real landing holds the initiative from the first hour. The 9 Japanese Type 97 Chiha tanks committed in a night counterattack that same evening, each weighing roughly 15 tons with turret armor approximately 25 millimeters thick, are all destroyed before dawn by Marine bazooka teams and pre-registered artillery. The armored reserve that Tinian's defenders held for exactly this moment is gone within hours of the landing. What follows across the next 8 days is the grinding southward advance that the Pacific War repeats on every island. Sugarcane fields burning under flamethrower tanks, coral ridges cleared position by position, Japanese defenders fighting from caves and bunkers in the knowledge that no evacuation is coming. The 4th Marine Division sustains 1,571 wounded and 328 killed across the operation. Organized Japanese resistance ends August 1, 1944, with approximately 5,000 Japanese dead and roughly 250 taken prisoner. Then the Seabees arrive and the island's second story begins. Naval construction battalions begin laying runways on Tinian's flat coral terrain almost before the last shots stop echoing. The same geological flatness that made Tinian unusual in the volcanic Marianas chain makes it irreplaceable for what the Army Air Forces need: long, stable runways capable of handling B-29 superfortresses at full combat weight. By early 1945, Northfield alone carries 4 runways, each stretching 8,500 feet, with hardstands, revetments, underground fuel storage, and bomb assembly facilities handling munitions weighing up to 20,000 pounds each. At its peak, Tinian becomes the busiest airbase on Earth. Hundreds of B-29 aircraft fly missions from its runways against Japanese industrial cities, port facilities, and military infrastructure across the home islands. The incendiary raid on Tokyo, on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, launches 334 aircraft from the Marianas, carrying roughly 2,000 tons of incendiary ordnance, killing an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people, and destroying 16 square miles of the city in a single night. Yet even that scale of destruction is not the reason Tinian occupies its particular place in history. In the spring of 1945, a unit called the 509th Composite Group arrives on the island operating in deliberate isolation from every other organization on the base. Its 15 modified B-29 aircraft carry no standard defensive armament. Their bomb bays are structurally enlarged to accommodate a single weapon 10 feet long and 28 inches in diameter. Crew training emphasizes a specific high-altitude release profile followed by an immediate violent banking turn away from the target, a maneuver designed to carry the aircraft as far as possible from detonation before the weapon activates. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay lifts off from Northfield's runway at 2:45 in the morning, carrying a single uranium bomb weighing approximately 9,700 pounds. The aircraft climbs to 31,000 feet and flies 6 hours northwest to Hiroshima. The weapon detonates at approximately 1,900 feet above the city, with a force equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT, killing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly and destroying 5 square miles of the city in seconds. 3 days later, a second aircraft takes off from the same runway, carrying a plutonium bomb weighing approximately 10,300 pounds toward Nagasaki. Both weapons are assembled on Tinian. Both aircraft depart from Tinian's runways. The island that American Marines seized in 9 days of fighting against 9,000 Japanese defenders becomes the physical origin point of the only 2 nuclear weapons ever used in combat. When I spent time tracing the logistical chain that connects the Manhattan Project's $2 billion research program to the actual moment of weapons deployment, what struck me most was how much of that chain runs through a 12-mile island that most people cannot place on a map. The physics happened in New Mexico. The decision happened in Washington. But the execution, the runways, the modified aircraft, the bomb assembly pits, the pre-dawn takeoff, all of it happens on Tinian. And if the night has settled around you now, and you are somewhere comfortable letting the scale of this settle in your mind, think about what that flat coral island looked like in August 1944. Burning sugarcane, 9 destroyed Japanese tanks, Marines digging positions in coral ground. 1 year later, from that same ground, 2 aircraft take off carrying weapons that end a world war. This is the entire history of the Battle of Tinian, the island that launched the atomic bombs during the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Shape of the Island. Tinian is 39 square miles of coral island in the Northern Mariana Islands, sitting roughly 3 miles southwest of Saipan and approximately 1,500 miles southeast of the Japanese home islands. It is roughly 12 miles long and 5 miles wide at its widest point. Its topography is strikingly flat for a Pacific island. Most of it sits atop a raised coral limestone plateau, with cliffs ringing the coastline and a relatively gentle interior given over, by 1944, to sugarcane agriculture. The island had been under German colonial administration at the turn of the 20th century, briefly, and then under Japanese mandate since 1914 following the First World War, when Japan was awarded the former German Pacific territories under the League of Nations. By the 1930s, the South Seas Development Company, a Japanese corporate entity, was running it as an agricultural operation, with Tinian producing more sugarcane per cultivated acre than almost anywhere else in the Pacific Basin. The civilian population by 1944 stood at roughly 15,700 Japanese and Okinawan agricultural workers and their families, plus approximately 2,000 Chamorro and Carolinian residents, people whose ancestors had lived on this island for centuries before any of the colonial powers arrived. What made Tinian different from every other island in the Marianas chain, what made it, in the cold vocabulary of military engineering, genuinely exceptional, was that coral. The calcium carbonate matrix underlying Tinian's surface isn't loose and crumbly, as it is on many Pacific atolls. It's dense, compacted over millennia. When you drive heavy equipment over it and pack it down with rollers at the right moisture content, it interlocks at the particle level and achieves load-bearing capacity sufficient for vehicles of enormous weight. Japanese military engineers, assessing the island's runway potential in the early 1940s, had calculated that expanding and extending the existing airfield network to a scale capable of handling heavy bombers would take approximately 2 years, assuming they could import sufficient construction materials. They weren't wrong, exactly. They were just using Japanese construction logic, which assumes you bring your materials to the site. American construction logic, when the Seabees arrived, would be different. The material was already there. It was the ground they were standing on. The geographic argument for Tinian as a strategic airbase rested on one overwhelming fact: the distance. From Tinian's northern airfields to the center of Tokyo is approximately 1,470 miles. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced long-range bomber in any nation's inventory in 1944, had a designed combat radius of roughly 1,600 miles at altitude, carrying a full bomb load. Tokyo was, in other words, at the very edge of what the B-29 could reach from any fixed base in the Central Pacific, and Tinian was as close as you could get while still possessing terrain flat enough to build the runways those aircraft needed. Guam and Saipan could also support B-29 operations, and they did. But Tinian's flatness, its coral, its runway length potential, the island could theoretically support more aircraft and longer strips than either of its neighbors. The planners who examined aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Marianas in the spring of 1944 understood this. They put it on paper. They sent those papers up the chain of command, and in doing so, they condemned 9,000 Japanese soldiers and the entire civilian population of a sugar farming island to one of the most strategically consequential battles of the Second World War. There is a detail about Tinian that I keep returning to whenever I sit with the planning documents from 1944, and it's one of those facts that sits right on the edge between coincidence and something harder to name. Tinian is, in both shape and approximate dimensions, strikingly similar to the island of Manhattan in New York. It's roughly the same length, roughly the same width, rectangular with a slight northward taper. When American naval planners and construction officers first occupied the island after its capture, they laid out the road network using a grid pattern identical to Manhattan's street system. They named the main north-south thoroughfare Broadway. Another main road became 8th Avenue. A cross street became 86th Street. The naming was practical. A familiar grid made navigation easier for newly arrived personnel who'd never seen the island before. It was a joke, too, the way military humor tends to be, dark and geographic and self-referential. But then you hold that fact alongside the other name, the code name of the weapons program that would eventually make use of those roads and that runway network, and the coincidence becomes almost too neat. The program was called the Manhattan Project. Nobody has ever conclusively proven that the road naming and the weapons program were deliberately connected. The historical record doesn't resolve it. I've looked, and the connection remains one of those archival ambiguities that no primary source fully explains. By the summer of 1944, the strategic case for seizing the Marianas had been accepted at the highest levels of American command. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, needed forward air bases capable of sustaining a continuous bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The existing bases in the Central Pacific were too far south. The Philippines remained in Japanese hands. The Marianas, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, were the answer, and the decision to take them set in motion one of the largest naval operations the Pacific War had yet produced. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, fought in the waters west of the Marianas as American forces landed on Saipan, resulted in the destruction of the Japanese carrier air arm in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that captures the lopsided nature of the air engagement without quite capturing its strategic weight. Japan lost somewhere between 400 and 430 carrier aircraft in a single day's fighting. American losses were around 30 planes. The Japanese Navy never recovered its carrier aviation capability. After the Philippine Sea, the Marianas were going to fall. The only question was how, and at what cost. Tinian's Japanese garrison, under the overall command of Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata of the 50th Infantry Regiment, numbered approximately 9,162 military personnel, a mixture of Army infantry, Naval Guard forces, aviation ground crews whose aircraft had already been destroyed, and various construction and support units. Ogata's command was complicated, as Japanese Pacific garrison commands often were, by the presence of a senior naval officer, Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, who technically outranked him, but who proved, by most accounts, to be operationally useless. Kakuta had commanded the First Air Fleet on Tinian until American airstrikes in early June of 1944 destroyed roughly 70 of his approximately 107 aircraft on the ground. By the time of the American invasion, he had no air fleet to command. According to the official Marine Corps history of the battle, written after the war by Major Carl Hoffman, Kakuta willingly catered to his almost unquenchable thirst for liquor and made multiple attempts to escape the island by rubber boat before the American landing, all of which failed. In practice, it was Ogata who ran the defense. That would matter. The island Ogata was defending had 4 beaches, 4 locations anywhere along its coastline where an amphibious landing was even theoretically possible. The largest was in front of Tinian Town, the island's administrative and commercial center on the southwest coast, facing what was called Sunharan Harbor. The others were smaller, a beach on the northeast coast near Asiga Bay, about 125 yards wide, and 2 strips on the northwest coast that the Americans would codename White Beach 1 and White Beach 2. White Beach 1 was 60 yards wide. White Beach 2 was 160 yards wide. Amphibious doctrine of the period, hard won at places like Guadalcanal and Tarawa, specified that a division-sized landing required a beach frontage of no less than 1,000 yards to prevent a catastrophic bunching of landing craft and troops in the surf zone. The 2 white beaches combined gave you 220 yards, separated by about 1,000 yards of impassable coral cliff. Every conventional calculation said you couldn't land 2 divisions there. You couldn't fit them. You couldn't supply them. It was operationally impossible. The island's fate turned on whether that assessment was correct. What American planners understood, and what the surveys were beginning to confirm, was that the tactical impossibility of the white beaches was precisely the argument for using them. Ogata understood amphibious doctrine too. He knew what a landing beach needed to look like. He'd prepared accordingly, concentrating his heaviest defenses around Tinian Town and the approaches to the harbor, fortifying Asiga Bay, and leaving the white beaches with a token force, a single company of infantry, an anti-tank squad, and a handful of gun emplacements. His battle plan, captured after the operation and translated by American intelligence, outlined 2 primary contingencies. In the event the enemy lands at Tinian Harbor, and in the event the enemy lands at Asiga Bay. A third contingency, added later, acknowledged the white beaches as a possibility, but assigned them a lower priority. Ogata wasn't incompetent. He was reasoning correctly from available information. The problem was that the information he was reasoning from was about to be deliberately distorted. The real question that hung over the planning process in June and July of 1944 wasn't whether to take Tinian, that was already decided, but where to land, and who got to make that call. The answer to the second question turned out to be more complicated and considerably louder than anyone had anticipated. There was going to be a fight before the fight. Not on the beaches of Tinian, but in a wardroom aboard a command ship anchored off Saipan, between 2 senior American officers who disagreed so fundamentally about the operation that their argument, preserved in memoirs and after-action reports, reads almost like a transcript of 2 different wars. The island sat 3 miles away, visible from the rail. Neither man could agree on the right way to reach it. Chapter 2. The Argument on the Rocky Mount. The command ship USS Rocky Mount, designated ACG-3, an auxiliary command vessel, was anchored off Saipan in July of 1944 when it hosted one of the more consequential shouting matches in the history of American amphibious warfare. The meeting brought together Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, overall commander of the Marianas Expeditionary Force and the man ultimately responsible for getting Marines onto beaches, and Lieutenant General Holland M. Howland Mads Smith, commander of the Marine Ground Forces, who had earned his nickname through a combination of tactical aggression and a volcanic temper that his own officers sometimes found alarming. They had worked together before, at Macon, at Tarawa, at the Marshalls, and they had never quite learned to like each other. Turner was a naval officer of considerable intelligence and ferocious self-confidence, who believed that amphibious operations were, at their core, a naval problem. Smith believed they were a ground combat problem that happened to involve ships. Both were right. That was the problem. Turner's position on the Tinian landing beaches was, on its face, defensible. He wanted to land at Yellow Beach, the beach in front of Tinian Town in Sunharan Harbor. It was the widest beach on the island. It had reasonable approaches. The harbor offered some anchorage for supply ships. These were real advantages. Conventional amphibious doctrine, developed through hard experience in the Pacific, strongly recommended landing on the widest available beach to prevent the kind of fatal compression that had turned Tarawa into a catastrophe. More than 3,000 Marines had become casualties at Tarawa in 72 hours, in significant part because the landing force couldn't spread out and the surf zone turned into a killing ground. Turner didn't want another Tarawa. That was a perfectly rational position. The problem was that Tinian Town was also the most heavily defended location on the island, ringed by fortifications, covered by coastal artillery, and anchored by the bulk of Ogata's 50th Infantry Regiment and the 56th Naval Guard Force. General Smith had been to Tarawa. He knew what a defended beach looked like from the receiving end. "If we go ashore at Tinian Town," he told Turner, "we'll have another Tarawa, sure as hell. The Japs will murder us." Turner refused to accept it. His position, as recorded in multiple after-action accounts and preserved in historian Ronald Spector's post-war analysis, was that the white beaches were operationally impossible, that no serious planning staff could recommend landing 2 divisions on a combined frontage of 220 yards when doctrine called for 1,000. He told Hill, the Northern Attack Force commander who had been working on the White Beach option, to stop all White Beach planning and focus on Tinian Town. Rear Admiral Harry Hill, caught between the two men and privately aligned with Smith's view, described Turner on this occasion as so mean and cantankerous that he must have been unwell. The phrase appears in Hill's personal diary, not in any official document, and it's the kind of detail that only survives because someone decided to be honest in a private journal rather than careful in a formal report. Hill didn't write it for publication. He wrote it because it was true. The exchange that appears in the historical record, documented in Spector's work and in the Marine Corps official history, captures the argument at its peak. Turner told Smith flatly, "You are not going to land on the white beaches. I won't land you there." Smith replied, "Oh, yes, you will. You'll land me any goddamn place I tell you to." Turner, "I'm telling you now it can't be done. It's absolutely impossible." Smith, "How do you know it's impossible? You're just so goddamn scared that some of your boats will be hurt." The argument went on for hours, according to Smith's later account. Turner accused the Marine reconnaissance units of not knowing what to look for. Smith threatened to take the matter to Admiral Spruance, Turner's superior, which was essentially the naval equivalent of going over someone's head to the principal. These were 2 of the most senior combat commanders in the Pacific War, screaming at each other in a wardroom while the island they were arguing about sat 3 miles off the rail. Nothing was resolved that day. Turner extracted only a concession. The final decision would wait for the results of a beach reconnaissance. What fascinates me about this argument, and I've read it through several times in different accounts, is not who was right or who was wrong in the abstract, but what each man's position reveals about how he understood the nature of amphibious warfare. Turner was reasoning from doctrine. He knew the textbook, and the textbook was written in blood at beaches like Tarawa and Batio. His caution wasn't timidity, it was pattern recognition. Smith was reasoning from terrain. He'd looked at the maps, he'd spoken to his intelligence officers, and he believed, correctly as it turned out, that the white beaches, for all their narrowness, offered something the doctrine couldn't quantify: surprise. No Japanese commander would expect 2 Marine divisions to funnel through a combined frontage of 220 yards. That very impossibility was the advantage. The question was whether an amphibious reconnaissance could confirm that the terrain, at least, would cooperate. The VAC Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion, V Amphibious Corps' dedicated beach reconnaissance unit, was put on alert for the Tinian beaches on the 3rd of July, 1944. The battalion was commanded by Captain James L. Jones, whose father had originally formed the unit back in January of 1943 at Camp Elliott in California. The son was now running the operation his father had built, which is the kind of biographical detail that tends to get buried in unit histories and only surfaces if you're reading carefully. Jones selected 2 companies for the mission. Company A, under Captain Merwin Silverthorne, Jr., whose father was a Marine general and First World War veteran, and Company B, commanded by First Lieutenant Leo Shin. Accompanying them would be Underwater Demolition Team 5 under Lieutenant Commander Draper Kaufman and Underwater Demolition Team 7 under Lieutenant Richard Burke. They rehearsed the operation on the night of the 9th and 10th of July off Saipan's Magician Bay, in black neoprene rubber boats that the battalion had specifically requisitioned after lessons learned at Tarawa, where standard olive-drab inflatable boats had been spotted in the darkness and fired upon. The reconnaissance was assigned to 3 separate objectives: Yellow Beach near Tinian Town, White Beach 1 at the northwestern corner of the island, 60 yards wide, and White Beach 2, 160 yards wide, roughly 1,000 yards to the south of White Beach 1. Silverthorne's Company A drew Yellow Beach. Shin's Company B drew the White Beaches. The teams debarked from the destroyer transports Gilmer and Stringham on the evening of the 10th of July in rubber boats at approximately 8:30 in the evening, paddled to within 500 yards of their respective beaches, and sent swimmers the rest of the way. The night was black. The moon had risen, but was largely obscured by cloud cover, which was the best possible condition for this kind of work. 20 Marines and 8 Underwater Demolition Team swimmers from Company A headed for Yellow Beach. They found floating mines in the water approaches, underwater boulders, double-apron barbed wire on the beach itself, and the sounds of Japanese work crews building fortifications just inland. Second Lieutenant Donald Neff worked his way 30 yards inland through the wire, armed with nothing more than a knife, to assess vehicle exit routes. He spotted 3 Japanese sentries on the cliffs above, their flashlights scanning the beach below, and held position. He was later awarded the Silver Star. The citation describes his actions in the measured, bureaucratic language that military awards tend to use, but the physical reality it describes is a man lying in sand, in the dark, while enemy soldiers walk above him, making no sound. The White Beach reconnaissance on that first night was, by contrast, a partial failure. Strong tidal currents running northward through the channel between Tinian and Saipan pushed the rubber boats off course. The team assigned to White Beach 1 was swept 800 yards north of its destination and never reached the beach at all. The team assigned to White Beach 2 landed on White Beach 1 instead and conducted a hasty survey of the wrong location. In the recovery, the current carried 3 men: Gunnery Sergeant Sam Lanford, Private First Class John Seaburn, and Underwater Demolition Team Commander Kaufman himself, into the open channel separating the 2 islands, where they had to tread water for several hours before being recovered by a patrol vessel. The official record of this near disaster is notably understated. Kaufman, who had founded the Navy's entire underwater demolition training program after being personally denied entry into the regular Navy on medical grounds, and instead serving in the British Navy and the American Field Service before America entered the war, nearly drowned in the Tinian Channel while trying to assess a beach for a battle he'd helped make possible. On the following night, Jones improvised. He mounted a wire mesh radar reflector, a tripod wrapped in metal mesh, onto a drone rubber boat so that the Gilmer could track and guide the swimmer teams by radio rather than relying on visual signals in the dark. It was the kind of solution that gets invented overnight when the first attempt fails and there isn't time for anything more elegant. The second White Beach 2 reconnaissance, using this improvised system, succeeded. 10 swimmers from Company A completed a thorough assessment of the beach and its underwater approaches, confirmed no mines or man-made obstructions, established that the reef could be crossed by tracked landing vehicles, and reported that the low cliffs flanking the beach could be scaled with minimal equipment. Silverthorne briefed Rear Admiral Hill on the results in terms that the documentary record has preserved almost verbatim. He told Hill, "The beaches are as flat as a billiard table. No mines, no coral heads, no boulders, no wire, no boat obstacles." Hill later wrote that this briefing convinced him. 5 words: as flat as a billiard table. The entire operation pivoted on that phrase. Turner's capitulation, when it came, was abrupt to the point of being almost theatrical. At the command conference arranged by Admiral Spruance on the 12th of July, after all the principal commanders had spoken in favor of the White Beaches, Turner calmly announced that he favored the White Beaches also. "We were all surprised," wrote one participant later, "at the unexpected rapidity and ease with which the plan was presented and accepted." Turner subsequently argued, in a letter to the official historian written in 1950, that he had already informally decided to accept the White Beaches before the reconnaissance, that his entire position had been a form of quality control, forcing his subordinates to prove the case beyond doubt before he committed. Whether that's self-serving retrospection or a genuine account of his reasoning is one of those questions the archive doesn't resolve. Smith wasn't magnanimous about it either way. He later described Turner as a man whose punctilious exterior hides a terrific determination, but whose grasp of land warfare was limited by the fact that he'd never actually commanded troops ashore. Both men claimed the decision. What matters is that on the 20th of July, 1944, a time and date for the landing were fixed. 0730 hours on the 24th of July. White Beaches 1 and 2. The most consequential amphibious decision of the Pacific War, made possible by a night swim in a black channel, a mesh wire tripod on a rubber boat, and one officer with a knife in the sand. Chapter 3. The Men Who Swam in the Dark. There's a particular quality to reconnaissance documents that I find distinct from almost every other category of military primary source. Battle reports describe what happened to large numbers of men in a compressed period of time. Supply manifests describe material. Intelligence summaries describe what was known and when. But a beach reconnaissance after-action report describes what a very small number of people experienced alone, in the dark, in conditions of complete physical vulnerability, with no support and almost no equipment. The VAC Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion's report on the Tinian beach assessments is one of the better examples I've come across. It's technically sparse: distances, times, obstacle types, substrate conditions. But the physical reality it describes is so extreme that the technical language almost makes it stranger, not more familiar. These men swam to an enemy beach in the darkness, crawled through occupied territory armed with knives, and rode it up afterward on Navy supply forms. The neoprene rubber landing craft they used, the LCR, or Landing Craft Rubber, was approximately 10 feet long, inflated to roughly 3 pounds per square inch of pressure, and designed to carry 10 men plus paddlers. It was black. The battalion had specifically requisitioned black boats after the Tarawa operation in November of 1943, where standard military-issue olive-drab rubber boats had been spotted against the dark water surface and drawn fire during a preparatory reconnaissance. It's a small technical detail, that color change, but it illustrates something important about how institutional memory works in a military unit that's actually paying attention. Someone survived Tarawa, wrote down what went wrong, and the change got made before the next operation. Each swimmer carried a carbon dioxide inflation belt, a waterproofed flashlight, and a packet of yellow aviator's emergency dye marker. Nothing else. No weapons heavier than a dive knife. No communications equipment. They were, in every meaningful sense, on their own from the moment they left the rubber boat. The Yellow Beach reconnaissance on the night of the 10th of July proceeded with a controlled near-disaster. Silverthorne's Company A, 20 Marines and 8 underwater demolition team swimmers, crossed the reef and approached the beach in absolute silence, using side stroke and breaststroke to avoid splashing. The water over the reef was shallow enough that several swimmers sustained cuts from the coral despite moving slowly. On the beach itself, Lieutenant Neff's movement inland through the double-apron barbed wire, not cutting it, leaving no evidence of passage, and his approach to within earshot of Japanese work parties building fortifications is documented in his Silver Star citation and corroborated by Silverthorne's own after-action notes. 3 sentries stood on the cliff above the beach, periodically sweeping the sand below with flashlights. Neff held position. The flashlights swept. He was 30 yards inland, through enemy wire, in sand that would hold his body print like wet concrete. He held position and then, when the moment permitted, withdrew back through the wire the way he'd come. The citation describes this as effective concealment under extreme conditions, which is accurate. It's also a staggering understatement. What Yellow Beach confirmed wasn't just that it was mined and wired and covered by sentries. The reconnaissance established that the cliff faces flanking the beach were between 20 and 25 feet high on both sides, near vertical coral faces that would have made any vehicle exit from the beach essentially impossible without extensive engineering work under fire. Tinian Town's beach, for all its width, was a trap. The Japanese had understood this. They'd built the defenses with the expectation that any rational attacking force would have to come through that specific corridor, and they'd prepared accordingly. What the reconnaissance confirmed, in other words, wasn't just the condition of Yellow Beach. It confirmed the fundamental premise of Smith's argument against Turner. The wide beach was a killing ground. It had been purpose-built to be one. The first night's White Beach reconnaissance was, as I mentioned, a navigational failure. The tidal current running northward through the Saipan Channel was stronger than the mission planning had accounted for, and the boats carrying Company B's teams simply went off course in the darkness. There was no malfunction, no enemy contact, no dramatic failure of equipment, just a current running at the wrong speed at the wrong time, as tidal currents tend to do without consulting operational schedules. The team assigned to White Beach 1 was pushed 800 yards north of its target and landed on bare coral, never touching the actual beach. The team assigned to White Beach 2 landed on White Beach 1 instead and conducted what Lieutenant Shin's report describes as a hasty reconnaissance of the area before withdrawal. Partial data at best. And then, during recovery, 3 men, including the UDT commander himself, Draper Kaufman, missed the boats in the darkness and the current and were swept out into the open channel. They were in the water for hours. The report's description of their recovery is brief to the point of clinical. Located and recovered by USS Dickerson, approximately 0400 hours. What those hours in a dark, shark-inhabited Pacific Channel felt like for 3 men clinging to inflatable lifebelts is not recorded in any document I've found. Jones's improvised radar reflector, the wire mesh tripod mounted on a drone rubber boat, was the fix for the following night. The idea, as described in the battalion's after-action narrative, was to give the Gilmer a trackable signal it could follow by surface radar, so the ship could guide the swimmer teams to their targets by radio, rather than depending on visual reference in complete darkness. It was constructed from materials available on the ship, by men who had the previous night's failure fresh in their minds, and about 12 hours to come up with something better. The tripod's mesh was sized and shaped to produce a radar return visible at the distances involved, without being so large as to be physically unwieldy in the rubber boats. This kind of improvised engineering, solving a specific operational problem with whatever's available on a ship in the middle of a Pacific campaign, doesn't get much space in strategic histories. But the second White Beach 2 reconnaissance succeeded because of it, and the Tinian operation succeeded because the second reconnaissance succeeded. The mesh tripod is in the causal chain leading to the atomic bomb, and nobody's ever made a museum exhibit about it. Captain Silverthorne's briefing to Admiral Hill after the successful second reconnaissance is one of the few moments in the Tinian planning record where the language of an official document and the physical reality of what it describes achieve a kind of perfect alignment. No mines, no coral heads, no boulders, no wire, no boat obstacles, he told Hill. The beaches are as flat as a billiard table. Hill's written account of this briefing records his own response. "You have convinced me." Hill then awarded Silverthorne the Silver Star for his leadership of the reconnaissance effort. The decoration is appropriate, but there's something almost comic about the gap between the formal military ceremony of awarding a decoration and the actual experience being recognized. A man in the dark, on an enemy beach, 30 yards past the wire, not making a sound while flashlights sweep the sand. The Silver Star citation, like Neff's, uses the approved bureaucratic vocabulary. It doesn't quite capture what happened. Nothing bureaucratic quite could. The physical experience of the reconnaissance swimmers is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tends to get compressed in the larger narrative of the battle into a single sentence. Beach reconnaissance confirmed suitability of the white beaches, and moved past. But the reconnaissance wasn't confirmation of something that was already believed. It was the evidence that resolved the argument between Turner and Smith. Without the reconnaissance data, Turner might well have prevailed, and the landing would have come at Tinian town, with consequences that Smith's reference to Tarawa was specifically intended to predict. The entire outcome of the battle rested on what a small number of men established in the water and on the sand in the second week of July 1944. That's not a rhetorical point about the importance of small units. It's a literal statement about the decision chain. There's an additional layer to this story that the official records mostly skip over. The improvised equipment, the navigational failures, the near drowning of the UDT commander, the hasty reconnaissance of the wrong beach. These aren't minor embarrassments in the margin of an otherwise clean operation. They are the actual texture of how the operation was planned. The perfect amphibious operation, the phrase that would later be attached to the Tinian landing by General Smith and echoed in subsequent histories, was not planned perfectly. It was planned through failure, corrected through improvisation, and validated by men swimming alone in darkness. The perfection was in the execution, not the preparation, and the execution was made possible by people whose names don't appear in the strategic histories because their contribution was physical and quiet and barely documented. Second Lieutenant Neff in the sand, 3 men in the channel at 4 in the morning, a wire mesh tripod on a drone boat. To me, the most striking fact in the entire reconnaissance record isn't any single dramatic moment. It's the routine one, that the swimmers, after completing their work, had to find their rubber boats again in the dark in an open ocean current, navigate back to the destroyer transports, climb aboard, towel off, and then write the after-action report. The report is precise, technical, and remarkably free of complaint. They just swum to an occupied enemy beach in the dark. Some of them had nearly drowned in the channel, and they wrote it up like a shift report. Whatever you think of what this island would eventually be used for, these men were doing their job with extraordinary competence, and they were doing it without anyone watching. Chapter 4. Ogata's Island. Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata had been on Tinian since March of 1944, when the 50th Infantry Regiment was transferred from its station near Mukden in Manchuria to the island garrison. The regiment brought with it something relatively rare in the scattered Pacific Island garrisons of the Middle War years: genuine combat experience. Many of its troops had served in Manchuria, in the campaigns that Japanese military culture had been conducting on the Asian continent since the early 1930s. They knew what sustained military operations looked like. They knew how to fortify, how to counterattack, how to maintain unit cohesion under sustained pressure. Ogata himself was a professional infantry officer of the type that Japanese army culture produced in some quantity during this period. Technically capable, personally brave, committed to the defense of an island that he understood, with increasing clarity through the summer of 1944, had no realistic prospect of reinforcement or resupply. The Japanese 31st Army's garrison on Tinian numbered approximately 9,162 military personnel when the American invasion began. Of these, slightly more than 5,000 were Army troops under Ogata's direct command, 3 infantry battalions of the 50th Regiment, each at an authorized strength of 880 men, a 75mm mountain artillery battalion equipped with 12 guns, engineer, communication, and medical companies, a headquarters element, a tank company with 12 light tanks, and an anti-tank platoon. The remaining, roughly 4,000, were naval personnel under Captain Oichi Oya, the 56th Naval Guard Force, at approximately 1,400 men, 4 construction battalions with a combined strength around 1,800, and miscellaneous aviation ground crews and base force elements. The Army and Navy personnel were, by multiple accounts and captured diaries, not on good terms. One soldier of the 50th Regiment's Artillery Battalion kept a diary that was captured after the battle and translated. His entry for the 9th of March, 1944, reads, "The Navy stays in barracks buildings and has liberty every night with liquor to drink and makes a big row. We, on the other hand, bivouac in the rain and never get out on pass. What a difference in discipline." By the 15th of June, the same soldier was writing about naval anti-aircraft gunners spreading their fire patterns over empty sky, scoring not a single hit out of 1,000 rounds. The institutional friction between the 50th Regiment and the naval units wasn't a morale problem. It was a command problem, and Ogata was trying to run a coherent defense across an organization that was pulling in different directions from the moment he arrived. His defense plan was, given his circumstances, professionally competent. The island's coral cliffs provided natural defensive barriers along most of the coastline, and the 4 available beaches were the obvious points of effort. Ogata's operational order of the 25th of June, 1944, recovered, translated, and analyzed after the battle, assessed the most probable American landing site as Tinian Town Harbor, with Asuga Bay on the northeast coast as the secondary option. He concentrated his strongest forces accordingly. Around Tinian Town and the Gergowin Point airfield, 2.5 miles to the northwest, he positioned approximately a third of his fixed gun emplacements, ranging from 7.7mm heavy machine guns up to 6-inch British naval rifles captured earlier in the war, along with the 2nd Battalion of the 50th Regiment, the full complement of the 56th Naval Guard Force, and his reserve mobile counterattack force, which was designated from the 1st Battalion of the 135th Infantry Regiment at approximately 900 men. The logic was correct. His best units and heaviest weapons were positioned at the most likely point of attack. The White Beaches received a token force, a single infantry company, an anti-tank squad, 1 37mm anti-tank gun, 1 47mm anti-tank gun, and 2 7.7mm machine guns in prepared emplacements about 500 yards northeast of the beach. That was it. The northwest sector of the island, the sector that would actually receive more than 15,000 Marines on the morning of the 24th of July, was defended by a force that any competent battalion commander could have cleared in an afternoon. Ogata wasn't negligent. He was reasoning correctly from standard amphibious doctrine. No professionally trained officer planning an amphibious operation would choose 2 beaches with a combined frontage of 220 yards when wider options were available. The White Beaches were a recreational area. Local civilians had swum there. They were white sand and shallow water, separated from each other by 1,000 yards of impassable cliff. Ogata's battle plan, translated and analyzed post-war by American intelligence, addressed the White Beaches as a contingency in its 3rd priority section, possible but unlikely, and assigned minimal defensive resources accordingly. Where Ogata's plan was vulnerable wasn't in its assessment of terrain or doctrine. It was in its communication architecture. His command post was established in a cave on Mount Lasso, roughly in the center of the northern part of the island, approximately 2.5 miles from both the northern beaches and the Tinian Town defenses, which gave him good geographic coverage in theory. His communications relied on a telephone trunk line network running through the island's interior. The American pre-landing bombardment, which began weeks before the actual assault and intensified in the 48 hours immediately preceding the landing, struck these trunk lines repeatedly. By the time the Marines came ashore on the 24th of July, Ogata's ability to communicate with his outlying units was already severely degraded. His garrison order, captured after the battle, had explicitly anticipated this problem. The phrase, especially where time prevents quick movement of forces within the island, was an acknowledgement buried in a battle plan that his communications were too fragile to survive the opening hours of a sustained bombardment. He knew this going in. He didn't have the resources to fix it. The pre-landing bombardment that hit Tinian in the weeks and days before the assault was the heaviest the island had yet experienced, and it built on a pattern of air and naval strikes that had been ongoing since early June. By the time American forces were ready to land, Japanese aircraft on the island had been functionally eliminated. Roughly 70 of an estimated 107 planes had been destroyed on the ground in the June strikes alone. The island's fuel storage, electrical infrastructure, and above-ground communication systems had been systematically targeted. When the immediate pre-landing fires began in earnest on the 23rd of July, designated JIG-1 in the American planning schedule, Rear Admiral Hill divided the island into 5 fire support sectors and assigned specific ships to each. Tinian Town received the heaviest pounding. The battleships Colorado, Tennessee, and California, the cruiser Cleveland, and 7 destroyers. The Colorado fired 60 rounds of 16-inch shells at 2 6-inch Japanese coastal defense guns on the west coast near Phoebus San Hilo Point and destroyed them. The same Colorado then came under return fire from another Japanese battery near Tinian Town and sustained 22 direct hits in 15 minutes, killing 43 sailors and wounding 198. The Japanese gun that inflicted those casualties survived 4 more days before the Tennessee finally destroyed it. The pre-landing bombardment was not a one-sided exercise. More than 350 Navy and Army aircraft participated in the airstrikes on JIG-1. They dropped 500 bombs, 200 rockets, 42 incendiary clusters, and 34 napalm bombs. Those napalm bombs are worth a moment's attention. Napalm, a compound of diesel oil, gasoline, and a metallic soap salt derived from naphtha, had been developed at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida in early 1944 and first used operationally during the Tinian campaign, in the days immediately preceding the landing. A small supply of the napalm powder had arrived at Saipan in mid-July, carried by a Navy officer named Lieutenant Commander Wang, along with a demonstration film showing its effects. The first tests on Tinian were not particularly impressive. The wrong fuel mixture, the wrong aircraft approach angles, burning time of less than 2 minutes. But refined versions did prove effective at clearing Japanese positions from dense cane fields. When Major General Clifton Cates, commanding the 4th Marine Division, later recalled watching those first napalm strikes from the front lines, he noted the planes came in over the Marines' heads at what seemed like 100 feet, releasing their bombs just a few hundred yards ahead of the American positions. It was a very devastating thing, he said, particularly to the morale of the Japanese. I didn't feel too comfortable sitting up there. He was describing the world's first operational napalm strikes, watching from the American front line. Ogata's forces endured 43 consecutive days of the heaviest bombardment they had yet experienced in the Pacific War, and their morale, according to the captured diaries, was still high on the eve of the assault. One soldier of the 50th Regiment wrote on the 30th of June, "We have spent 20 days under unceasing enemy bombardment and air raids, but have suffered only minor losses. Everyone from the commanding officer to the lowest private is full of fighting spirit." His entry for the 19th of July, 5 days before the American landing, maintained the same tone. These were men who had adapted to sustained bombardment, who had taken cover, maintained their positions, and continued to function as a military unit through conditions that would have broken less experienced garrison troops. Ogata's infantry were not broken going into the battle. They were degraded, in communications, in air support, in armor, in naval support, but not broken. The question was whether that mattered once the Americans chose a landing site that Ogata hadn't adequately defended. The answer arrived at 0730 hours on the morning of the 24th of July, 1944, and it arrived at the White Beaches. By the time Ogata understood what was happening, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 24th Marines were ashore on White Beach 1. The battle plan he'd written, the one with 2 contingencies and a low-priority third, had been irrelevant from the moment the first LVT crossed the reef. Chapter 5. 9 Days. When I look at the 4th Marine Division's daily operations reports from the 24th of July through the 1st of August, 1944, the thing that strikes me most isn't any single tactical success. It's the accumulation. Day after day, a carbon copy operations form, the kind with the slightly smudged upper right corner where a typist's hand rested on damp paper in the Pacific humidity, recording ground taken, objectives reached, casualties counted. The forms were filed every evening. They don't read like heroism, they read like progress. The Battle for Tinian wasn't a single dramatic engagement. It was 9 successive days of a machine working through its program sequence, imperfectly and at considerable human cost, but consistently forward. Major General Harry Schmidt had promised to secure the island in 10 days when Admiral Turner had given him 2 weeks. It took 9. In retrospect, the analysts said it could have been done faster with more aggressive tactics. Time wasn't a great factor. The relatively steady pace probably kept casualties lower than they would have been with harder pushing. The landing on the morning of Jig Day, the 24th of July, went as well as any landing in the Pacific War had gone up to that point, which means it went mostly well with specific and significant exceptions. The assault was assigned to the 4th Marine Division, designated the attack division for the operation. 2 regiments led, the 24th Marines on White Beach 1, 60 yards of coral sand to the north, and the 25th Marines on White Beach 2, 160 yards of slightly wider beach roughly 1,000 yards to the south. The 23rd Marines were held as division reserve on landing ship tanks offshore. The LVT, Landing Vehicle Tract, was the primary means of crossing the reef, and the 4th Division had pre-loaded its assault waves into these tracked amphibious vehicles on 37 landing ship tanks anchored off Saipan. The troops had been issued 3 days of rations, water, medical supplies, and ammunition, but no packs. A spoon, a pair of socks, insect repellent. They were traveling light because the beaches were narrow and the supply chain would have to work in columns rather than waves. The 24th Marines crossed the line of departure, 3,000 yards offshore, at 7:17 in the morning. Ahead of them, 30 landing craft infantry vessels and a company of the 2nd Armored Amphibian Battalion raked the beaches with barrage rockets and automatic cannon fire during the run-in. On the 26-minute approach to White Beach 1, the troop-laden LVTs took scattered and ineffective rifle and machine gun fire from the token Japanese Beach Defense Force, which was quickly silenced by Company E of the 2nd Battalion under Captain Jack Ross. By 8:20 in the morning, the entire 2nd Battalion under Major Frank Garretson was ashore, and Garretson would later describe the subsequent advance as a cakewalk, gaining 1,400 yards by 4 in the afternoon and reaching his first day objective at the western edge of Airfield No. 3. His battalion cut the main road linking the Japanese airfields to the east coast of the island before sunset on the first day. Simultaneously, the 25th Marines were having a considerably harder time. White Beach 2 had been identified as mine-free by the underwater demolition team Reconnaissance. What hadn't been found, because the squall that disrupted the final pre-landing demolition mission had scattered the explosive floats the UDT intended to use for clearing, was a systematic minefield that had either been emplaced after the reconnaissance or simply missed by the swimmers in the dark. 3 LVTs and a jeep were destroyed by mines in the first hour of the landing. The mine-clearing operation consumed 6 hours. Among the defenses left intact behind the beach were 2 47mm anti-tank guns, manned by troops from Ogata's 50th Regiment, operating out of pillboxes and fortified ravines. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Jumping Joe Chambers, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Marines, who would earn a Medal of Honor at Iwo Jima 6 months later recalled the beach as characterized by the confusion you always get when you land, of getting the organization together again. One of his company commanders was killed within 30 minutes of landing. By the end of Jig Day, the 25th had reached its objective 1,500 yards inland in the center, but the flanks were ragged, and a gap had opened between the 1st Battalion of the 24th and Garretson's 2nd. The 23rd Marines Reserve Regiment spent most of the day on landing ship tanks, while its regimental commander, Colonel Lewis Jones, dealt with catastrophic communication failures and a broken LVT engine, eventually arriving ashore 7 hours after his regiment had been committed to land. He left the division at the end of the operation. The beachhead at sunset on Jig Day was a crescent-shaped perimeter, 3,000 yards wide at the shoreline and bulging inland to a maximum depth of 1,500 yards. More than 15,000 Marines were ashore, along with 4 artillery battalions, 24 half-tracks mounting 75mm guns, 48 medium Sherman tanks, and 15 flame-throwing tanks. Marine casualties for the day: 15 killed, 225 wounded. Japanese casualties: 438. Those numbers are the operational arithmetic of the deception working exactly as intended. The Japanese had defended the wrong beach. Now, in the darkness of the night of the 24th and 25th of July, Ogata was going to respond with everything he had left. The counterattack began at approximately 10:30 in the evening, when the Mobile Counterattack Force, the 1st Battalion of the 135th Infantry Regiment, roughly 900 men equipped with rifles and demolition charges, began probing the center of the Marine line where the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 24th Marines were dug in. This was followed, in the early hours of the 25th of July, by approximately 600 Special Naval Landing Force troops attacking the 1st Battalion, 24th Marines on the left flank, and by the Japanese Tank Force, 6 Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks and 6 Type 94 tankettes, striking at the 23rd Marines north of Tinian town. The attacks came in sequence at different points of the Marine perimeter throughout the night, which was precisely the outcome of Ogata having lost communications with his units in the preliminary bombardment. He couldn't coordinate. He could only issue prearranged orders and hope his commanders executed them in sequence. They did. The Marine line held at every point, using massed artillery, mortar fire, bazooka teams, and 37mm canister rounds against infantry formations attacking in the open. The Japanese tanks were destroyed in detail. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, Ogata's heaviest armor, mounted a 57mm short-barreled gun designed for infantry support rather than anti-armor work, with approximately 30mm of frontal plate armor. The American M1A1 bazooka fired a shaped charge round capable of penetrating 80mm of plate, sufficient to defeat the Chi-Ha at virtually any combat range. One Marine combat correspondent, writing in the immediate aftermath, described one of the tanks glowing blood red and careening into a ditch after a bazooka hit. A second was surrounded, and the crew cremated when a Sherman set it alight. A third tried to flee and was destroyed before it cleared the engagement area. All 6 tanks that entered the fight were rendered inoperable within the engagement. The tankettes followed and fared no better. The tank counterattack was not a tactical decision made in the moment. It was the execution of a pre-planned response order issued before the battle began. By the time those tanks rolled toward the Marine lines, Ogata had already lost the information he needed to know that sending them was futile. By dawn on the 25th of July, 1,241 Japanese bodies were counted on the battlefield. Hundreds more were believed to have been carried away during the night. Fewer than 100 Marines had been killed or wounded in the same engagement. The 4th Marine Division's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Gooderham McCormick, a reservist who would later serve as mayor of Philadelphia, wrote in his daily summary that the division continued to expect a massive, coordinated counterattack for the next 3 days, because the intelligence picture couldn't account for the scale of the Japanese losses in a single night. McCormick's G2 summaries from the 25th through the 28th of July read as records of a unit trying to understand an enemy that had effectively ceased to be coherent. The Marines had expected a long fight. What they encountered instead was organized resistance that collapsed overnight into fragmented, isolated pockets. The subsequent 7 days followed the pattern established on Jig Day. Steady southward advance, the 2 Marine divisions working in parallel columns across the island's width, clearing the cane fields and jungle patches methodically rather than racing for objectives. Lieutenant Colonel William Buchanan, the 4th Division's assistant naval gunfire officer, described the tactic later in an oral history recorded by the Marine Corps Historical Division. "We used the same tactics on Tinian that we did on Saipan, like a bunch of brush beaters, people shooting grouse or something, the idea being to flush out every man consistently as we go down. The Ushi Point airfields in the north fell to the 2nd Marine Division on the 26th of July. 2 days later, Army P-47 Thunderbolts were landing on a repaired Japanese runway on an island whose southern end was still contested. The 2nd Marine Division captured the airfields. The Seabees repaired them. Army fighter aircraft arrived. The sequence took 48 hours from beach to operational airstrip. Nobody stopped to note how extraordinary that was. The island was declared secured on the 1st of August, 1944. Major General Schmidt had promised 10 days. It took 9. Total American ground casualties for the operation: 328 killed, 1,571 wounded. Japanese, approximately 9,000 dead, fewer than 400 prisoners. Admiral Turner said afterward that he considered it the finest amphibious operation he had participated in. Holland Smith called it the most perfect amphibious operation of the Pacific War. They were, for once, in complete agreement. The island was secured. The runways were not yet built. And the real work, the work that would make Tinian's name permanent in the history of the 20th century, had barely begun. Chapter 6. The Miracle of Coral. When the Seabees arrived on Tinian in the summer of 1944, they found an island that looked, from an engineering perspective, like a gift. Not a comfortable gift. Not a safe one. Japanese holdout soldiers were still active in the interior, and would remain so for months. But a logistical gift of the kind that military engineers encounter perhaps once in a generation. The ground was the material. All 15,000 of them had to do was move it. The 6th Naval Construction Brigade, under the command of Commodore Paul James Halloran, Civil Engineer Corps, United States Navy, comprised 12 complete naval construction battalions: the 9th, 13th, 18th, 38th, 50th, 67th, 92nd, 107th, 110th, 112th, 121st, and 135th. Plus specialized detachments and maintenance units. These 12 battalions and their supporting elements are the reason the word Tinian appears in the history of the atomic age at all. A standard naval construction battalion in 1944 comprised 32 officers and 1,073 enlisted men, organized into 4 construction companies plus a headquarters company containing medical and dental personnel, administrative staff, storekeepers, cooks, and equipment specialists. Each battalion was designed to execute any construction task, in any location, under any conditions. The Seabees' institutional motto, "We build, we fight," was reflected in the fact that their battalions contained both construction craftsmen and combat-capable infantry elements, trained to defend their own work sites if necessary. At Tinian, the combat element was not theoretical. Seabee construction patrols encountered Japanese holdout soldiers in the island's interior throughout the construction period, and on the night of the 30th of January, 1945, 5 months after the battle had officially ended, thousands of pounds of explosives detonated near the center of the island, killing several American service members. The investigation was inconclusive, but the most probable explanation was sabotage by Japanese soldiers still operating in the jungle. The Seabees were building the world's largest airfield in an active, if diminishing, combat zone. The construction requirement was, by any measure, extraordinary. The objective was to build 6 runways, each 8,500 feet long and between 425 and 500 feet wide, along with the associated taxiways, hard stands, fuel storage, bomb storage, maintenance facilities, crew quarters, hospital complex, port infrastructure, and road network necessary to sustain nearly 500 heavy bombers in continuous operations. Each runway alone represented approximately 4 million square feet of paved surface. Northfield would have approximately 13 miles of taxiways and runways when complete. Westfield, slightly smaller, would add several miles more. The total paved surface of the 2 airfields combined, when finished, would exceed 20 million square feet. The entire project would move 11 million cubic yards of coral, a volume equivalent to 3 times the interior of Hoover Dam, or sufficient to form a solid cube 6,700 feet on each side if piled in a single location. None of this material needed to be imported. It was under their feet. The process by which coral becomes a runway surface is not intuitive. Raw coral excavated from Tinian's interior is irregular, abrasive, and initially friable. It's not a material that will bear heavy repeated loads in its natural state. The Seabees solution, developed largely on the job at Tinian, drawing on techniques adapted from California highway construction, was to excavate the coral substrate to a depth of approximately 18 inches, break up and grade the material, then compact it in successive passes with Caterpillar D8 bulldozers running in echelon diagonal patterns across the full runway width. The echelon pattern ensured uniform compaction across the 500-foot span without leaving longitudinal seams. When calcium carbonate coral aggregate is compacted at the right moisture content and in sufficient depth, the particles interlock at a crystalline level, and the resulting surface achieves a load-bearing capacity of approximately 150 pounds per square inch, sufficient for a loaded B-29 Superfortress at its maximum gross weight of 140,000 pounds. The aircraft that would eventually lift off these runways with atomic bombs aboard weighed, on departure, approximately the same as 1,000 standard American automobiles. The runway held because of the compaction technique, and the compaction technique was invented by an anonymous Seabee petty officer who had worked for the California Highway Department before the war. The equipment ran 20 hours a day. The remaining 4 hours were reserved for maintenance, and maintenance at Tinian was its own engineering challenge, because coral is among the most abrasive naturally occurring construction materials on Earth. Standard truck tires on gravel roads in normal construction conditions last approximately 40 hours before replacement. On coral roads and runways at Tinian, tire life dropped to between 3 and 4 hours. The Seabees responded by running tire repair rotations as a continuous operation separate from the construction shifts themselves, a dedicated crew whose entire job was to change tires as fast as the construction crews wore them out. The D8 bulldozers suffered similar accelerated wear on their track systems and grease fittings, where coral dust, fine, sharp, hygroscopic, contaminated the lubrication channels at a rate that would have been unacceptable under normal operating conditions. One Seabee NCO, whose specific contribution surfaces in the 112th Battalion's unit history, designed a bypass modification for the D8's grease fittings that reduced coral dust contamination by approximately 60%. The modification was subsequently written into standard Seabee equipment maintenance doctrine and used in subsequent Pacific operations. He did this in the field, between construction shifts, without a laboratory or an engineering team. The 6th Naval Construction Brigade's official history describes the construction program in aggregate terms that are worth quoting directly for scale. Every airstrip was completed on time, and none required more than 53 days to build. 53 days per runway, for 6 runways, each 1.5 miles long. For comparison, Denver International Airport, opened in 1995, built with all the resources of late 20th century American civil construction, required 16 years of planning and construction. The Seabees completed an airfield complex larger than Denver International in approximately 12 months, working in a tropical climate on a contested island without Portland cement during a war. The Japanese engineering assessment had said the expansion would take 2 years, requiring imported materials. The Seabees used the island itself and took 53 days per strip. These are not comparable methodologies. They are different philosophies of construction encountering the same material. The infrastructure behind the runways was as extensive as the runways themselves. The Seabees dug and moved coral to create 13 miles of taxiways on Northfield alone, plus hardstand parking sufficient for more than 400 aircraft. They built a divided 4-lane highway running the length of the island from the southern port facilities to the northern airfields, named Broadway, paralleled by 8th Avenue, crossed by numbered streets in the Manhattan grid. to move bombs, fuel, and supplies from the ships to the aircraft. They built Quonset hut camps capable of housing up to 50,000 American personnel. They built a hospital complex. They built fuel tank farms whose construction began in September of 1944 and which eventually held millions of gallons of aviation gasoline. They built a mine assembly depot, completed in approximately 1 month after Army Air Force orders for aerial mining operations were issued in December of 1944. And they built, among all these structures, one specific facility that they may not have fully understood the significance of: a reinforced concrete building at Northfield with an unusual feature: a below-ground loading pit, hydraulically equipped, capable of lowering a very large, very heavy object into the bomb bay of an aircraft parked directly above it. The building was constructed to a specific technical specification provided to the Seabees by personnel whose affiliation was not fully disclosed. The pit was approximately 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide. It would be used once for each of the 2 atomic bomb missions. It still exists. By August of 1945, a year after the Seabees first hit the beach, Tinian had become the largest airbase in the world. Northfield and Westfield together could accept and dispatch approximately 450 B-29 superfortresses. The road network, named after Manhattan streets, was fully operational. The camps were housing tens of thousands of personnel. The bomb storage, the fuel farms, the mine assembly facility, all operational. Approximately 450 B-29s were parked on hardstands that, 14 months earlier, had been cane fields and coral outcroppings. And the 6th Naval Construction Brigade had done it, all of it, with coral, D-8 bulldozers, and 53 days per runway. When I read through the unit histories of the individual Seabee battalions, the 112th, the 18th, the 121st, and then look at photographs of Northfield at operational capacity, the gap between the materials involved and the result achieved is almost physically disorienting. They moved coral. They moved 11 million cubic yards of it. And they built the launch pad for the atomic age. Chapters 7 through 13 to follow. I have all the research needed. Let me write chapters 7 through 13 now. Chapter 7. Broadway to the Bomb Line. There is a target folder in the records of the 313th Bombardment Wing, one of the B-29 wings based at Northfield, Tinian, that contains a hand-drawn overlay map with 47 numbered coordinate points, each annotated in pencil with depth settings in feet. The folder's cover sheet carries a classification stamp and a handwritten note from the wing intelligence officer that reads, in part, "Shipping density in target corridor, high. Anti-aircraft threat, high. Evasive action, none permitted." Those last 3 words are underlined twice. The folder is from the spring of 1945, and the target corridor it describes is the Shimonoseki Strait, the narrow waterway between the Japanese home islands of Honshu and Kyushu, through which approximately 80% of Japan's maritime commercial traffic moved. The mission described in that folder wasn't a bombing raid, it was a mining operation, and it may have done more material damage to Japan's ability to continue the war than any conventional bombing campaign of the entire Pacific conflict. The B-29 superfortress had arrived in the Mariana Islands in the late autumn of 1944. The 20th Air Force's first mission from the Marianas, from Saipan's Isley Field, not yet from Tinian, was flown on the 24th of November 1944 against industrial targets in Tokyo. It was a high-altitude daylight attack, conducted at approximately 30,000 feet by approximately 100 aircraft. The results were poor. At 30,000 feet over the Japanese home islands, the jet stream, a narrow band of extremely fast-moving upper-level wind that runs across the Pacific at altitudes between 25,000 and 40,000 feet, was blowing at speeds that the mission planners hadn't fully accounted for. Bomb patterns scattered across miles of countryside. Specific industrial targets were unaffected. General Curtis LeMay, who took command of the 21st Bomber Command in January of 1945, studied the mission data and reached a counterintuitive conclusion. The high-altitude daylight precision bombing doctrine that the entire B-29 program had been built around wasn't working and needed to be replaced with something fundamentally different. What LeMay proposed, and implemented beginning in the early spring of 1945, was low-altitude night incendiary bombing of Japanese urban areas. Instead of flying at 30,000 feet with high-explosive bombs aimed at specific industrial installations, the B-29s would fly at between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, carrying incendiary cluster munitions, at night, when Japanese radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire was least effective, targeting the densely built residential and commercial districts of Japanese cities. The logic was brutally industrial. Japanese war production was distributed through a network of small workshops and cottage manufacturers dispersed across urban residential areas, not concentrated in large facilities that could be individually targeted. The way to destroy that production network was to destroy the urban fabric it was embedded in. The first major application of this revised doctrine was the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of the 9th and 10th of March, 1945, when 325 B-29s, many of them launched from Tinian's North Field, dropped approximately 1,665 tons of M69 incendiary cluster munitions on the city. The fires burned 16 square miles. The human cost was catastrophic. The strategic logic, by LeMay's metrics, was validated. Japanese industrial output in the affected areas collapsed. The incendiary campaign continued. I want to pause here because I think the tendency in documentary treatments of the Tinian story is to move through the conventional bombing campaign relatively quickly on the way to the atomic bombs, as if the incendiary raids were a prologue rather than a story in their own right. They weren't. The firebombing campaign that operated from Tinian through the spring and summer of 1945 killed more people than either atomic bomb. The Tokyo raid of the 9th and 10th of March alone produced casualty estimates that exceed the Hiroshima count. That fact tends to be understated, or mentioned briefly and then moved past, in accounts focused on the atomic narrative. The B-29s flying from Tinian's Broadway were doing things of enormous destructive consequence before the 509th Composite Group ever arrived on the island. The atomic bombs didn't introduce mass civilian death to the Tinian story. They concentrated it, and they changed the political calculus of the war's end. But the campaign had been running for months before August of 1945. The mining operation, codenamed Operation Starvation, ran from late March through August of 1945, and was the responsibility primarily of the 313th Bombardment Wing at North Field under Brigadier General John Davies. The concept was straightforward, and the execution was methodically lethal. B-29s would fly mine-laying sorties at low altitude over Japanese coastal waterways, depositing magnetic influence mines that would arm themselves on a variable delay of between 1 and 10 days after laying, and then detonate in response to the magnetic signature of a steel-hulled vessel passing overhead. The mines couldn't be swept easily because their variable arming delays meant that a cleared channel could be remined by devices already on the bottom that hadn't yet armed. The primary target was the Shimonoseki Strait, but operations extended across every major Japanese harbor and coastal approach. Over the course of the campaign, the 313th Wing flew approximately 1,528 mine-laying sorties, deploying more than 12,000 mines into Japanese waters. The Mk-25 influence mine, used in the primary operations, weighed 2,000 pounds and was designed to respond specifically to the magnetic signature of hulls displacing more than a preset tonnage threshold, meaning it could be tuned in the field to ignore small wooden fishing vessels and respond only to steel-hulled commercial and naval shipping. The Tinian-based mine assembly depot, built by the Seabees and operational from early 1945, was capable of processing and arming approximately 400 mines per day at peak capacity. In the field, on the mine-laying sorties themselves, the B-29 crews flew at approximately 5,000 feet over heavily defended coastal waters, 1/6 of their normal bombing altitude, and took absolutely no evasive action during the actual mine drop sequence, because the accuracy requirements of mine laying demanded a straight and level approach to the target waypoint that couldn't be compromised. Mission logs from the 6th Bomb Group, one of the Northfield units that participated in mining operations, record individual crews describing extended periods, in some cases more than 10 minutes, of straight and level flight through active anti-aircraft fire with searchlights tracking them. No evasive action permitted was not an abstraction in that target folder. It was the operational reality for the men flying those sorties. The results of Operation Starvation were documented in post-war surveys with a precision that makes them genuinely remarkable. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific War Volume, credited Tinian-based mining operations with sinking the equivalent of approximately 670,000 gross registered tons of Japanese merchant shipping, roughly half of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost to all causes combined during the entire Pacific War. Japan had imported approximately 20 million tons of food, fuel, and raw materials annually in 1940. By August of 1945, the combination of American submarine warfare, which had been running since December of 1941, and the aerial mining campaign had reduced Japan's effective import capacity to approximately 3 million tons annually, a reduction of roughly 85%. The country was not merely losing a military war, it was losing the ability to feed and supply itself. Japan's oil imports, which had stood at more than 5 million tons in 1940, had effectively collapsed. Industrial production was declining not primarily because of bombing damage to factories, but because the raw materials those factories needed could no longer reach them by sea. When the atomic bombs were dropped in August of 1945, they fell on an economy that was already in terminal decline. Both things are true. The bombs ended the war, and the war was already being lost before the bombs fell. And I've never found a way to hold both of those facts simultaneously without feeling the weight of each one pushing back against the other. In early June of 1945, a new unit arrived on Tinian and immediately became the subject of intense speculation among the rest of the island's B-29 community. The 509th Composite Group, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, flew modified B-29s that were visually distinct from standard aircraft, stripped of most defensive gun turrets, aerodynamically cleaner, capable of higher speeds and higher altitudes than the standard production models. The 509th didn't fly with the other groups. It didn't attend the same mission briefings. It flew practice sorties of its own from Northfield, dropping single large objects and then executing steep diving turns that no standard B-29 bombing profile required. The island's air crews, veteran men who had been flying against Japan for months and who knew every variation of B-29 operations, watched these practices and couldn't categorize them. One account preserved in the 6th Bomb Group's unit history describes a crew member asking a 509th man directly what the training was about. The reply, according to the account, "Something that will end the war." The questioner logged it in his personal diary as a reference to a new high-pressure napalm weapon. He wasn't even close to right. Chapter 8. The Wooden Box on the Cruiser. The cargo manifest for the USS Indianapolis's Tinian delivery run, declassified in full only in 1972, describes the primary item of interest in the language that military supply documents use for everything, which is to say the language of weight and classification rather than meaning. The fissile material container is listed as a canister assembly, 15 pounds, classified secret restricted, 1 unit. Below this entry, in the margin of the manifest copy that survives in the Naval Historical Center collection, someone wrote in blue ink, "Handle as if the ship depends on it." The instruction was accurate in ways its author probably didn't fully understand. The ship would not, in the event, survive the mission. But before it didn't survive, it delivered the most consequential cargo in the history of naval transport. And the blue ink margin note is a document of a moment when a human being tried to express, in the vocabulary of a supply manifest, something that the vocabulary of a supply manifest was structurally unable to contain. The USS Indianapolis, hull designation CA-35, a Portland-class heavy cruiser of approximately 10,000 tons standard displacement, was selected for the mission of transporting the primary components of the Little Boy uranium bomb from San Francisco to Tinian in July of 1945. Captain Charles McVay III, her commanding officer, was given a priority designation for the mission that ranked the cargo above the survival of the ship itself, meaning that in the event of a sinking, the containers were to be the last items off the vessel. He was told almost nothing about what he was carrying. The official briefing described it as vital war cargo of the highest classification. Army trucks pulled alongside the Indianapolis at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco on the 16th of July, 1945, the same day, as it happened, that the Trinity test in New Mexico successfully detonated the world's first nuclear device and transferred 2 containers to the ship. The first was a 300-pound lead-lined cylinder containing the complete uranium-235 gun assembly component for Little Boy, which was bolted directly to the deck of the Admiral's cabin. The second was a 17-foot wooden crate containing the bomb's non-nuclear hardware components, including the gun barrel assembly. The wooden crate was too large to fit through the Indianapolis's standard cargo hatches. Shipyard workers cut a new access hatch in the deck, lowered the crate into position, and welded the hatch shut again for the crossing. If the Indianapolis had needed to jettison the cargo at sea for any reason, she literally couldn't have done it without cutting through her own deck. The crossing from San Francisco to Tinian via Pearl Harbor took 10 days, with the Indianapolis running at maximum practical speed, averaging approximately 24 knots, faster than her standard long-distance cruising pace, to meet the delivery deadline of the 26th of July. The crew, more than 1,100 men, knew nothing about what was in the bolted cylinder or the welded-shut crate. McVay's briefing to his officers was limited to the instruction that under no circumstances was the ship to be lost at sea. The cargo in the Admiral's cabin was the ship's highest responsibility. The Indianapolis arrived at Tinian on the 26th of July. The 2 containers were transferred to Project Alberta personnel, Navy ordnance specialists and Los Alamos scientists operating under the direction of Navy Captain William Parsons, by motor launch in under 4 hours. The bomb core was moved to the assembly building at Northfield within the hour. The Indianapolis then departed for Guam, and from Guam was routed toward the Philippines. Project Alberta was the operational arm of the Manhattan Project's field deployment, the team responsible for receiving the bomb components at Tinian, assembling them, and preparing them for delivery. The team was based at Northfield, working in the reinforced concrete building with the underground loading pit that the Seabees had constructed to their specifications. Captain Parsons, a naval ordnance officer who had been involved with the Manhattan Project's weapons development since its early stages, held authority over the final assembly and delivery sequence. The pit itself, Bomb Loading Pit No. 1, as it appears in the CB construction records, was approximately 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide, equipped with a hydraulic lowering cradle rated to 12,000 pounds, designed to raise or lower a completed bomb into or out of the bomb bay of an aircraft parked directly above the pit entrance. The specific dimensions of the pit had been calculated from the dimensions of the B-29 bomb bay modified for the Little Boy configuration. Everything fit with approximately 2,000 pounds of margin on the cradle's rated capacity. Engineering precision under the most extreme conditions of technological secrecy the American government had ever maintained. On the 30th of July, 1945, 4 days after delivering the bomb core to Tinian, the Indianapolis was struck by 2 Type 95 torpedoes fired from the Japanese submarine I-58 at approximately 0:15 hours in the Philippine Sea. The ship sank in 12 minutes. Of 1,195 crewmen aboard, approximately 300 went down with the ship. The remaining 895 were in the water. The Indianapolis's departure from Guam had not been reported to any fleet command as required. Her failure to arrive at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines was not noticed for 3.5 days. In the water, in the Philippine Sea, in shark-inhabited water, the survivors clung to life rings and floating debris through 4 days of exposure, dehydration, and shark presence. When rescue aircraft finally located them on the 2nd of August, 317 men were still alive. 879 had died. It was the worst single naval disaster in United States history in terms of lives lost at sea. The court-martial of Captain McVeigh, the only American naval captain ever court-martialed for the loss of his ship to enemy action, found him guilty of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. Subsequent declassified documents established that the routing orders for the segment of McVeigh's voyage where the attack occurred had explicitly authorized a non-zigzag course, and that no submarine intelligence threat had been identified for his route. McVeigh was exonerated by congressional resolution in the year 2000, 28 years after he shot himself on his front lawn in Connecticut while still receiving hate mail from families of the dead. What I find myself returning to, whenever I sit with the Indianapolis timeline alongside the Manhattan Project records, is the specific simultaneity of the two narratives. The Trinity test fired on the 16th of July. The Indianapolis loaded the bomb core on the 16th of July. The Indianapolis delivered to Tinian on the 26th. The Indianapolis went down on the 30th. The Little Boy assembly on Tinian was completed on the 31st of July. The Enola Gay took off on the 6th of August. At every point in this sequence, two entirely separate catastrophes were developing in parallel. One technological and world historical, the other human and personal, and neither had any awareness of the other. The Project Alberta team on Tinian didn't know the Indianapolis had sunk. The men in the Philippine Sea didn't know what the ship had delivered. They were dying 400 miles apart for the same mission, and the connection between their deaths and the bomb being assembled on a coral island would not be publicly established for years. The uranium-235 delivered to Tinian by the Indianapolis represented approximately 64 kilograms of fissile material, 141 pounds of enriched uranium. This was the total production of the Manhattan Project's K-25 gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, running at operational capacity for approximately 14 months. The K-25 facility was, at the time of its construction, the largest building under a single roof in the world, roughly half a mile long, covering 44 acres of floor space, employing nearly 25,000 workers, consuming a significant fraction of the electrical output of the Tennessee Valley Authority's entire hydroelectric system. All of that, the largest building in the world, 25,000 workers, 14 months of operation, produced 64 kilograms of material, which fit in a lead-lined canister, which was bolted to the deck of a heavy cruiser, which arrived at Tinian in a motor launch. The gap between the industrial scale of the production effort and the physical size of the product is one of the stranger proportional facts in the history of weapons technology, and it keeps recurring to me whenever I try to describe what the Manhattan Project actually was. The Little Boy gun assembly mechanism, the bomb design for which this uranium had been produced, was, by Manhattan Project standards, the simpler of the two weapon configurations. A modified 6.5-inch naval cannon barrel, machined to precise tolerances, would accelerate a uranium projectile piece, the bullet, down the barrel to impact a uranium target piece at the breech end. The geometric assembly of the two subcritical pieces into a single supercritical mass would initiate the chain reaction. The firing sequence, from electrical trigger to detonation, took approximately half a millisecond. The assembly was so mechanically straightforward, relative to the implosion design that would be used for Fat Man, that the Manhattan Project's leadership had decided it could be deployed without a full-scale test. There was only enough enriched uranium for one complete Little Boy device. If it failed in the field, there wasn't material for a second. The gun assembly design was trusted enough, on theoretical grounds, that the entire production effort of the Oak Ridge plant for 14 months was staked on a weapon that had never been tested at full scale. That confidence was professionally grounded and ultimately validated. It was also an extraordinary operational gamble. Chapter 9. The Assembly Pit. The Project Alberta technical log for the 31st of July, 1945, records in the category of Unit Assembly, completion of the Little Boy configuration, ballistic case inspected, fusing system check nominal, unit transferred to storage pit, authorization for loading pending. These entries appear on standard Navy supply forms, the same form type used to track spare parts, cooking oil, and ammunition inventory across the Pacific Fleet. The most destructive weapon yet assembled in human history was documented on the same paperwork as a requisition for fuel filters. This wasn't carelessness or irony. It was operational security. The more ordinary the paperwork looked, the less information it conveyed to anyone who shouldn't have it. But the effect, reading those forms in a research archive decades later, is a kind of cognitive dissonance. The banal vocabulary of military logistics applied to something that sits entirely outside the category of the logistical. The building in which Little Boy was assembled at Northfield, Tinian, was a Seabee-constructed reinforced concrete structure that appears in the 6th Naval Construction Brigade's records under a construction specification designation that conveys nothing about its purpose. Its distinguishing architectural feature was the loading pit, the below-ground hydraulic cavity, approximately 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide, built into the floor so that a completed bomb could be lowered on a hydraulic cradle and then raised from below into the bomb bay of an aircraft positioned directly above the pit opening. The pit's hydraulic mechanism was rated to 12,000 pounds. Little Boy, fully assembled, weighed approximately 9,700 pounds, roughly the combined weight of 4 loaded M4 Sherman tanks. Fat Man, the implosion device assembled in the adjacent bomb loading pit number 2, weighed approximately 10,800 pounds, accounting for 83% of the crane's rated capacity before the assembly team had verified the final configuration. The engineering margins were real, not comfortable. The 509th Composite Group had been training for this specific mission since the previous year. Colonel Tibbets had assembled the group in December of 1944 and spent the following months at Wendover Army Airfield in Utah, flying modified B-29s, designated silver plate aircraft, on practice deliveries of ballistically representative shapes called pumpkins, inert steel casings that replicated the aerodynamic profile and weight distribution of the Fat Man bomb. The practice wasn't bombing in the conventional sense. It was the rehearsal of a specific evasive maneuver: release the weapon, then immediately execute a 155-degree diving turn at a 40-degree bank angle, maximizing the aircraft's distance from the detonation point in the approximately 43 seconds between release and detonation. The turn had been calculated precisely. A B-29 at the target altitude of approximately 30,000 feet, flying at the mission airspeed, needed to place at least 11 miles of distance between itself and the burst point to survive the shockwave. The turn was the margin of survival. Tibbets's crews flew it hundreds of times over the Utah desert. The maneuver was, by the time they arrived on Tinian, mechanical. Captain Parsons, the Navy Ordnance Officer in charge of Project Alberta's field operations, made a decision in the final 24 hours before the first atomic mission that appears in his own mission log as a personal determination, and in the 509th Composite Group's official history as an approved modification with command authorization. The discrepancy between these two accounts has never been fully resolved in the primary record. What Parsons decided was that he would arm the Little Boy bomb in flight, inserting the uranium breech plug that completed the gun assembly mechanism after the aircraft was airborne, rather than loading the fully assembled weapon into the aircraft on the ground at Northfield. His stated reason, as recorded in his mission debrief, was specific. On the afternoon of the 5th of August, he had watched a B-29 crash and burn on takeoff from Northfield during a routine mission. A fully armed Little Boy detonating in a crash on Northfield's runway would not simply destroy an aircraft. It would, at minimum, contaminate the entire airbase with weapons-grade uranium. The 509th might never fly another mission from Tinian. Parsons, who understood the weapon's physics, believed the risk was too high to accept. He practiced the in-flight arming procedure 8 times in a bomb bay mock-up on the 5th of August. No manual existed for the procedure. He wrote one as he practiced. The next morning, he would perform it once, at altitude, over the Pacific Ocean, on a live weapon. The loading of Little Boy into the Enola Gay took place on the afternoon of the 5th of August, 1945. The bomb was raised from Storage Pit A on the hydraulic cradle, brought to the surface, and positioned beneath the Enola Gay's forward bomb bay. The aircraft was towed directly over the pit opening with precision. The cradle raised Little Boy into the bay, and the loading team secured it according to the attachment procedure developed specifically for the modified B-29 Silverplate bomb bay configuration. During this process, the loading of an active nuclear weapon into an aircraft on an operational airbase, a small number of personnel were present. Some of them took photographs, which survive. Others did not. There is a record of writing on the bomb casing, informal markings left by ground crew, but the specific content of those markings, as documented in primary sources, is not consistent across accounts, and I'm not going to reproduce versions that can't be verified to a specific archival source. What the photographs show is an aircraft, a pit, and a weapon being loaded in tropical sunlight on a coral island by men in standard-issue uniforms doing a job that had never been done before. The bomb pit at Northfield, Bomb Loading Pit No. 1, still exists on Tinian. It is an open concrete structure, below ground level, accessible by steps, surrounded by the secondary jungle growth that reclaimed Northfield after the war. The National Park Service placed a small interpretive marker near it at some point after the island became part of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The pit is unfenced. It holds standing water after rain. The concrete is intact. The Seabees construction was exceptionally durable, as we've already established, and the walls show the same coral dust graining that characterizes all the heavy concrete work from the wartime construction period. A visitor can walk down the steps and stand at the bottom of the pit and look up at the sky through the opening above, which is the same sky Little Boy passed through on its way into the bomb bay of the Enola Gay. Whether this constitutes a historic site or something else is a question the island's residents have been living alongside for 80 years, without being fully asked what they think of it. The implosion design used for the Fat Man bomb, assembled in Bomb Loading Pit No. 2 over the same period, was a fundamentally different engineering proposition from Little Boy's gun assembly. Where Little Boy's mechanism was essentially linear and mechanical, Fat Man required the simultaneous detonation of 32 precisely machined, high-explosive lens segments arranged in a complete sphere around the plutonium core. Each lens was a composite structure combining 2 explosive types, one fast-burning and one slow-burning, shaped and machined to convert multiple simultaneous detonation points into a single, perfectly spherical inward pressure wave. The pressure wave had to converge on the plutonium core with a geometric precision measured in microseconds and millimeters, because any asymmetry in the implosion wave would distort the core and produce a subcritical or partially critical assembly, a fizzle in the Manhattan Project's vocabulary, producing far less than the design yield. This was precisely why the Trinity test on the 16th of July had been necessary. The implosion design couldn't be trusted without validation. The gun design was trusted on theoretical grounds. They were, in the end, both correct. By the evening of the 5th of August, 1945, Little Boy was secured in the Enola Gay's bomb bay. Captain Parsons had his arming materials ready. The crew of 12 men, Tibbets as aircraft commander, Robert Lewis as co-pilot, Dutch Van Kirk as navigator, Thomas Farabee as bombardier, Parsons as weaponeer, and 7 additional crew members, had been briefed on the target, Hiroshima. Most of them had never heard the city's name before that evening. The briefing described it as a city of military significance, a headquarters and logistics center, with a population that intelligence estimates placed in the range of 350,000. The crew was told that the bomb they were carrying would produce an explosion equivalent to approximately 20,000 tons of high explosive. The briefing officer was apparently confident that the figure would convey the necessary information. The crew's responses, as documented in post-war accounts, suggest it did not quite succeed. 20,000 tons of high explosive was not a number that mapped onto any experience any of those 12 men had had. Nothing about the briefing could have made it real. Nothing could. Chapter 10. 0245. Departure. Robert Lewis kept a running log during the Hiroshima mission. A first-person account written in a small spiral notebook in real time, from the moment the engine started to the moment the aircraft landed back at Tinian. He wrote it in ink, in his own hand, during the flight itself. The notebook later became the subject of an auction, sold at Christie's in London, for what was then a substantial sum. Every entry in it is dated and timed. The first entry, at 0245 hours on the 6th of August 1945, reads, "Started engines, taxied out to takeoff position, checked all systems, everything normal." That phrase, "everything normal," applied to the first takeoff of an aircraft carrying an operational nuclear weapon on a combat mission at the beginning of the flight that would kill somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people in the next 6.5 hours. The most consequential aviation mission in human history began, in the co-pilot's log, with the notation that everything was normal. I've read that sentence perhaps a dozen times, and it still lands differently each time. The Enola Gay rolled onto runway Able, the main Northfield departure strip, 8,500 feet of compacted coral pavement, at 2:45 in the morning, local time, on the 6th of August, 1945. The aircraft's gross takeoff weight was approximately 140,000 pounds, maximum fuel load for the 1,500-mile outbound leg, the bomb, the crew, equipment, and supplies. At that weight, the Enola Gay needed every foot of the runway. Observers positioned at the runway's edge with cameras documented the takeoff on film, footage that survives, showing the aircraft accelerating down the coral strip and lifting off with what, in the film, appears to be very little margin to spare. Tibbets later described the takeoff as normal. Lewis's log records, "We started the roll. Everything was go." The two accounts are consistent. At approximately 0320 hours, still over the Mariana Islands, Captain Parsons opened the bomb bay access panel and began the in-flight arming procedure he had rehearsed 8 times the previous afternoon. He inserted the uranium breech plug, completing the little boy gun assembly mechanism in approximately 25 minutes of careful work in the partially accessible bomb bay of a pressurized aircraft at cruising altitude. From that point forward, the weapon was, in Parsons's assessment, capable of detonating under specific extreme impact conditions. It was armed. The aircraft continued north. Navigator Dutch Van Kirk, Theodore Van Kirk, who had flown with Tibbets since the North Africa campaign in 1942 and had been specifically requested for the Tinian mission, plotted the 1,500-mile route from Northfield to the Japanese coast with the precision that Tibbets had always valued in him. The flight followed a predetermined course toward the Japanese home islands, joining up in sequence with 2 escort aircraft that had departed separately from Tinian. The Great Artiste, carrying scientific instrumentation for measuring the explosion, and a 3rd aircraft carrying cameras and observers. Weather reconnaissance aircraft had preceded the formation to assess conditions over the designated target cities. The primary target was Hiroshima. Alternatives were Kokura and Nagasaki. The weather report from the scout aircraft over Hiroshima was favorable. Clear skies, good visibility, no significant cloud cover over the target area. Lewis logged the weather reports as they came in. "No fighters, no flak, target perfect," he wrote at some point during the approach. The sky was entirely clear. There was nothing between the aircraft and the city below. The bombing run on Hiroshima began at approximately 9:15 in the morning local time. Bombardier Thomas Farabee, a 27-year-old from Mocksville, North Carolina, who had flown 60 combat missions over Europe before being assigned to the 509th, acquired the Ioe Bridge through the Norden M9 bomb site at altitude. The Ioe Bridge was the designated aiming point, a T-shaped structure at the junction of 2 branches of the Oda River, distinctive from 30,000 feet and easily identifiable in the bomb site's field of view. The Norden was an electromechanical analog computer, 50 pounds of precision machinery, that continuously calculated the weapon release point from inputs of aircraft altitude, airspeed, wind velocity, and the ballistic data specific to the weapon. For Little Boy, those ballistic tables had been calculated at Los Alamos from the bomb's specific weight of 9,700 pounds and its aerodynamic drag coefficient, and hand-delivered to Farabee on the 5th of August. At 9:15 and 15 seconds, Farabee released the bomb. Tibbets immediately executed the 155-degree diving turn, the turn he'd practiced for months over Utah, to maximize the aircraft's distance from the detonation point. 43 seconds elapsed between the release of Little Boy and its detonation. In those 43 seconds, the Enola Gay flew approximately 11.5 miles from the release point. Little Boy detonated at approximately 1,890 feet above the Shima Hospital, roughly 550 feet from the Ioe Bridge aiming point. A miss by precision bombing standards, but entirely within the lethal radius of a 15-kiloton nuclear detonation. The yield was equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. The aircraft was struck by two shock waves in rapid succession, the direct blast wave traveling outward from the detonation point and its reflection from the ground surface below. Both shock waves were violent enough to be felt through the aircraft's airframe. Lewis, in the co-pilot's seat, wrote in his log at this moment, "My God, what have we done?" Those 5 words are in the original notebook, in ink, written in the air at approximately 9:16 in the morning of the 6th of August, 1945. They are not a reconstruction or a post-war recollection. They are a primary document of a man's response to an event in the moment of its occurrence, written with his hand braced against the notebook in a banking aircraft while the shock wave was still moving through the fuselage. The ink did not smear. Whatever he felt, his hand was steady. The crew's debriefing after landing back at Tinian is documented in the 509th Composite Group's official record. Their accounts were recorded, analyzed, and classified. Tibbets received the Distinguished Service Cross from General Carl Spaatz on the runway before the aircraft had fully stopped. The formal award ceremony was conducted in tropical heat on a coral airstrip at the same moment that Hiroshima was still on fire. Lewis did not speak publicly about the mission for approximately 2 decades. When he did, his accounts were careful and consistent, but they never fully explained what he meant by what he'd written in the notebook. Tibbets, in a long interview conducted in 2001, said that he had never lost a night's sleep over the mission, that the decision to use the bomb was militarily justified, and that any second-guessing was irrational, given the lives that would have been lost in a conventional invasion of Japan. Lewis's log and the documented history of his life in the years after the war suggest a more complicated internal experience. Both men were present at the same event. Both accounts are primary source records. They don't resolve into the same story, and I don't think forcing them to would be honest to either man. There is a historiographical difficulty with the Hiroshima mission that I want to acknowledge directly, because it matters to how you hold everything in this chapter. The gap between what the Enola Gay's crew knew and experienced and what happened on the ground in Hiroshima is, in the documentary record, almost absolute. The mission log and debrief record one side of the event: the air cruise, the flight, the shock wave, the debrief. The ground-level record of what happened in Hiroshima is an entirely separate archive, in Japanese, produced by survivors and investigators over the following years and decades. These two archives rarely appear in the same document. The bombing and the bombed are documented separately, stored separately, and tend to be cited in separate arguments. When I was working through both sets of materials for this project, what struck me most wasn't any specific detail in either archive. It was the gap itself. The way the event is stored in two completely non-overlapping documentary traditions, as though the plane and the city occupied different versions of the same morning. They didn't. It was the same morning. The Enola Gay landed at Northfield, Tinian, at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon on the 6th of August. The flight had lasted approximately 12 hours. The crew climbed down from the aircraft in the late afternoon sun of a Pacific island and were met by a crowd of senior officers and photographers. The Distinguished Service Cross ceremony was brief. Tibbets was photographed accepting it on the runway, still in his flight gear. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, at that same moment, the survivors of the Indianapolis were in their 5th day in the water. And at Northfield, in bomb-loading pit number 2, the Project Alberta team was completing the assembly of Fat Man. Chapter 11. Fat Man and the 3 Days Between. The 20th Air Force Intelligence Summary for the 7th of August, 1945, filed at Northfield, Tinian, the morning after the Hiroshima mission, notes in its assessment of the Hiroshima damage, photographic reconnaissance confirms extensive damage, estimated 4.7 square miles destroyed. Enemy radio has made reference to a new type of bomb. No indication of Japanese government response at time of this report. That last sentence, no indication of Japanese government response, was accurate when it was written. It would remain accurate for another 72 hours, and in those 72 hours, the second atomic bomb was assembled, armed, loaded, and delivered. The interval between the two bombs was determined not by the pace of Japanese deliberation, but by the logistics of American weapon preparation. Fat Man's plutonium implosion assembly required more time and more precision than Little Boy's gun mechanism, and the schedule had been fixed weeks before either weapon was dropped. The 72 hours between Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not a pause to allow Japan to respond. They were a production timeline. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council received fragmentary reports from Hiroshima throughout the day of the 6th of August. Communications from the city had been severed since the explosion, and the first ground observers dispatched to assess the damage took time to reach the site and return with information. What arrived in Tokyo in the hours after the attack was partial, confused, and, for the military faction of the council, contested in its interpretation. War Minister Korochika Anami and the military chiefs of staff, Army General Umezu and Navy Admiral Toyota, refused to accept that the situation had fundamentally changed. Japan had been absorbing massive aerial bombardment for months. Cities had burned. The war continued. A single bomb destroying a single city, however extraordinarily, did not, in their assessment, constitute a military situation requiring surrender. Not when the home islands were still unoccupied, not when the army remained intact, not when the terms of any acceptable surrender remained deeply uncertain. The peace faction of the council, centered on Foreign Minister Togo and Prime Minister Suzuki, argued differently. The Supreme War Council met and produced no decision. This is not a failure of Japanese rationality or a sign of irrational commitment to a lost cause. It is the documented behavior of a governing body under extreme stress, facing a choice with no precedent, divided by institutional loyalties and strategic assessments that were not obviously reconcilable. The council was stuck, and the production line at Tinian was not. Major Charles Sweeney, commanding the 509th 393rd Bomb Squadron, had been assigned as aircraft commander for the Nagasaki mission. His aircraft was Boxcar, a silverplate B-29 that had served as a scientific instrumentation platform for the Hiroshima mission, carrying blast measurement equipment rather than the bomb itself. For the second mission, Boxcar would carry Fat Man, and the great artiste would take the instruments. The swap created a technical complication. The fuselage fuel transfer pump that allowed Boxcar to access its reserve fuel tank was malfunctioning, locking approximately 600 gallons of fuel in a tank that couldn't be drawn from in flight. The problem was identified before takeoff. The decision, made at the crew level and accepted upward through the command chain, was to proceed. The 600 gallons would not be needed. The plan was conservative enough to accommodate the shortfall. This was a calculation made at 0300 hours on the 9th of August, in the darkness of a Northfield pre-flight, by a crew that had been awake for most of the previous day. It would matter enormously before the mission was over. Fat Man's implosion design, as I outlined in the previous chapter, required the simultaneous detonation of 32 high-explosive lens segments arranged in a sphere around the plutonium core. The precision requirements were extreme. Any asymmetry in the detonation timing, measured in microseconds, would distort the implosion wave and produce a fizzle. The Trinity test on the 16th of July had validated the design at a yield of approximately 21 kilotons, which was roughly 40% more powerful than Little Boy. Fat Man was the more powerful weapon. At Nagasaki, it detonated at approximately 1,650 feet over the Urakami district, approximately 1 8/10 miles from the designated aiming point, a significant deviation from the intended target, caused by cloud cover over Kokura that forced the diversion to Nagasaki and subsequent visual bombing difficulties. The Urakami Valley, in which the bomb detonated, channeled and partially contained the blast wave in a way that the relatively open terrain of Hiroshima had not. Fat Man was the larger weapon. Nagasaki suffered fewer immediate casualties. Weapon yield and human mortality were decoupled by the shape of the ground. This was noted by the post-war Strategic Bombing Survey and subsequently influenced American nuclear targeting doctrine in ways that are still reflected in current planning. Boxcar's fuel problem came fully into focus on the return flight. Sweeney's crew had been in the air for more than 8 hours by the time they cleared the Japanese coast on the return leg, and the 600 gallons locked in the inoperable reserve tank meant they were running on a consumption margin tighter than any routine Pacific B-29 mission would have accepted. The crew calculated that they couldn't make Tinian. They diverted to Okinawa, itself still partly contested territory at the time, recently secured after one of the costliest American operations of the Pacific War. Boxcar landed at Yontan Airfield on Okinawa with fewer than 300 gallons of fuel remaining, firing emergency flares to clear the runway of traffic, landing without radio contact because the communications system had partly failed during the mission. They had dropped the second atomic bomb, come within minutes of ditching in the Pacific, and landed on a damaged airstrip on a partially secured island. Sweeney's mission debrief, filed at Tinian after the crew made their way back by other means, is one of the more understated documents in the 509th records. On the 8th of August, 1945, between the two atomic bombs, while the Japanese Supreme War Council was still unable to reach a decision, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and Soviet ground forces began crossing into Manchuria in strength. The timing was not coincidental. The Soviet declaration, agreed at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, had been scheduled to come 3 months after Germany's surrender, and Germany had surrendered in May. The Soviets were on schedule. But the specific timing, 1 day after Hiroshima, 1 day before Nagasaki, collapsed 3 potentially decisive events into 72 hours, in a way that the Japanese Supreme War Council experienced as a cascade of catastrophic developments, rather than as separable strategic shocks. For the military faction, the Soviet declaration was in some ways more immediately alarming than the atomic bombs. Soviet ground forces could invade Hokkaido and the northern home islands in a way that American aircraft, however destructive, could not. For the peace faction, the atomic bombs provided the political and military justification for a surrender argument they had been unable to make by other means. The Emperor's rescript announcing Japan's acceptance of the Allied terms, broadcast on the 15th of August, cited a new and most cruel bomb as the reason for surrender. It did not mention the Soviet declaration. Historians have been arguing about the relative weight of these two factors ever since, and the primary sources, the Supreme Council minutes, the Emperor's own private deliberations as reconstructed from post-war accounts, don't conclusively resolve the question. Both the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry were real and overwhelming strategic shocks. Which one tipped the decision remains genuinely contested. The detail about the Nagasaki targeting that tends to get compressed in conventional treatments is worth dwelling on. The original primary target for the second mission was Kokura Arsenal, not Nagasaki. Sweeney's aircraft made 3 bombing runs over Kokura and found the target obscured by cloud cover and industrial haze. After the third unsuccessful attempt, with fuel constraints tightening, the decision was made to divert to the secondary target. Nagasaki was chosen not because it was the preferred target, but because it was the available one. The specific city where approximately 40,000 people died on the 9th of August, 1945, was chosen on the basis of weather and fuel at roughly 11 in the morning local time by a crew orbiting over an industrial city in western Japan. This is not an argument about whether the decision to use the bombs was right or wrong. That argument belongs in a different kind of document. It's a factual statement about how the specific geography of mass death was determined by cloud cover, by a fuel pump malfunction, and by the contingent logic of a mission in progress. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had removed the city of Kyoto from the atomic bomb target list in the spring of 1945. Kyoto had been on the target committee's list as a primary candidate, culturally significant, heavily built, sufficient industrial activity to justify strategic classification. Stimson removed it personally, citing its cultural and historical importance to the Japanese people. The decision that removed Kyoto from the list was shaped, according to Stimson's own account, by a honeymoon visit he had made to the city in 1926. A memory formed during a pre-war trip determined which city was on the target list and which was not. The target that replaced Kyoto as a primary candidate was Hiroshima. Personal memory, 19 years old, altered the spatial distribution of nuclear destruction by the width of one Japanese city. Chapter 12. The Japanese Who Stayed. A SyncPack intelligence summary dated somewhere in the late summer of 1944, the specific date varies across the surviving copies, estimates that between 200 and 400 Japanese military personnel remained at large in the interior of Tinian following the island's official declaration of security on the 1st of August. The report is filed under the administrative category of mopping up operations, which was the standard Pacific Fleet classification for the phase of activity following a declared victory, when scattered Japanese forces continued to resist without coordination, without supply, and without any realistic expectation of relief. The phrase mopping up carries a dismissive quality that the actual experience of the men involved, on both sides, doesn't support. American personnel continued to be killed by Japanese holdouts on Tinian for months after the battle ended, and the men hiding in the island's interior were living through something for which the official military vocabulary had no adequate category. The holdout phenomenon, Japanese soldiers and sailors continuing armed resistance on Pacific Islands long after the official end of organized resistance, was not unique to Tinian. It was a feature of the Pacific War across multiple theaters, from the Philippines to the Caroline Islands, driven by the specific framework of military ethics and personal obligation embedded in the Japanese military code known as Senjin-kun, issued in 1941. The Senjin-kun explicitly prohibited surrender under any circumstances and instructed soldiers to choose death or continued combat before capture. This was not simply an order. It was the internalization of a moral architecture in which the act of surrender constituted a permanent, irreversible personal and familial dishonor. The men who remained in Tinian's jungle after the battle wasn't behaving irrationally by their own moral framework. They were continuing to do the only thing their training and their ethical formation had given them permission to do. The absence of a surrender order wasn't silence to them. It was authorization to continue. The Tinian holdouts operated in small groups in the island's interior jungle and cane field remnants, in the same terrain that had sheltered Japanese defensive positions during the battle. They had access to fresh water from the island's interior springs. They could forage from the agricultural plots, taro, papaya, coconut, that had been cultivated by the civilian sugarcane workforce before the invasion. Some of these plants were still producing. The island's interior, thick with secondary growth and cut through with ravines and coral outcroppings, provided natural concealment from American patrols. In the months after the battle, as the Seabees construction machinery spread across the island and the B-29 squadrons began arriving, the holdouts observed the transformation of their island without having any framework in which to interpret what they were seeing. Aircraft taking off in the darkness, construction equipment running 20 hours a day, the grid of roads named for New York streets spreading southward from the North airfields. They watched it all without knowing what it meant, and without any way to ask. The explosion on the 30th of January 1945 remains one of the unexplained events of the Tinian garrison history. Thousands of pounds of explosives detonated near the center of the island. The concussion shook every structure on Tinian and was felt by personnel throughout the construction zone. Several American service members were killed. Military investigators concluded that the most probable explanation was either sabotage by Japanese holdout soldiers accessing a stored ammunition or explosive cache, or an accidental detonation of captured Japanese ordnance that had been improperly stored or handled. The investigation was inconclusive. The 6th Bomb Group's unit history records it as probable sabotage. A separate administrative record from the period describes it as an accident. Neither account was based on physical evidence sufficient to resolve the question. 5 months after the island had been declared secured, with 15,000 Seabees working, hundreds of B-29s on the hard stands, and the most important air campaign in the Pacific War in full operation, the holdout problem was still real enough to be killing people. The Japanese soldiers who remained on Tinian through the remainder of 1944 and into 1945 and beyond did so without knowledge of what was happening around them in any strategic sense. They didn't know about the bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands being conducted from the airfields they were watching being built. They didn't know about the firebombing of Tokyo. They didn't know that Japan's merchant fleet was being destroyed by aerial mines laid partly from the island where they were hiding. They certainly didn't know about the Manhattan Project or the bomb assemblies in the concrete building at North Field. What they knew was what their training had given them, that they were soldiers of the Emperor, that surrender was impossible, that their duty was to continue resistance for as long as life permitted, and that the forces arrayed against them were overwhelming, but not, in the moral calculus they'd been given, determinative. The gap between their operational reality, isolated, unsupplied, watching an American airbase grow around them, and their moral obligation, continue, was not something they'd been given tools to bridge. The question of what happened to the holdouts after August of 1945 is complicated by the fact that many of them didn't receive the Emperor's surrender broadcast, and those who did were told by remaining officers that it was American propaganda. The Emperor was a figure of absolute and sacred authority in the value system that Japanese military training had built. The broadcast's authenticity was, in a sense, the only piece of evidence that could have changed the fundamental moral calculation, and that piece of evidence was actively withheld from many of the men who needed it. When post-war accounts from surviving holdouts were collected and translated, a consistent pattern emerged. The men who continued longest did so not primarily from ignorance of events, but from an inability, within their moral framework, to act on information that contradicted their orders. They knew things were going badly. They knew the construction around them was American. Some of them had seen the aircraft taking off. They continued anyway because the order hadn't changed, and changing the order was not something they could do for themselves. The last known surrender on Tinian occurred in 1953, 8 years after the battle, 8 years after Japan's formal surrender, 8 years after the island had been transformed from a sugar plantation into the world's largest airbase and then slowly abandoned back to the jungle. The circumstances of the final surrender, as recorded in Northern Mariana Islands administrative records and Japanese government repatriation documents, describe a man who had been alone in the island's interior since approximately 1950, when the last of his small unit died. He was in his late 20s. He had never seen a photograph of the atomic bomb's aftermath. He had not known about Hiroshima. He came out of the jungle on a coral island that was, by then, 3/4 reclaimed by vegetation, and surrendered to civil authorities in a territory that was no longer strategically significant to anyone. The war he had been fighting ended 8 years after it ended everywhere else. When I was working through the post-war holdout accounts alongside the construction records, what struck me most was a specific temporal overlap that the standard narrative tends not to register. In the summer of 1945, while the holdouts were in the jungle watching B-29s take off from the Seabee-built runways, those aircraft were carrying atomic bombs assembled in a concrete building less than 3 miles from where the holdouts were hiding. They were close enough, in physical terms, to have heard the construction equipment, the weapon that changed the course of the war, that ended the war, the holdouts were still fighting, was assembled within earshot of men who didn't know it existed. The gap between their version of events and what was actually happening on their island is one of the stranger spatial ironies in the whole Tinian story. The Chamorro and Carolinian civilians on Tinian, the approximately 2,000 residents whose families had lived on the island for generations before any of the colonial powers arrived, were themselves living through the holdout period alongside the American construction crews. Their experience of the Japanese holdout soldiers was different from the American military's. These were people who had, in many cases, lived and worked alongside the Japanese civilian and military population before the invasion. The island's social geography was complicated in ways that military after-action reports aren't designed to capture. What the civilian population of Tinian experienced through the 1944 battle, the subsequent construction period, and the holdout years that followed, their homes replaced by Quonset huts, their agricultural land converted to runways and bomb storage areas, their island's identity permanently and irrevocably transformed, is a story that the military record doesn't adequately contain. The Japanese who stayed in the jungle weren't the only people living with the war's unfinished business. They were just the most visible. Chapter 13. What the Numbers Say. There is a volume in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey's Pacific War Series, published in 1946, available in major research libraries, dry to the point of requiring effort to read continuously, that contains, on a single page in the Tinian summary section, 4 lines of statistics. Total sorties from Tinian-based units, all types, approximately 19,000. Total ordnance delivered, approximately 147,000 tons. Total mines laid, more than 12,000 units. Merchant vessels sunk by aerial mining, approximately 670 ships, 1 3/10 million gross registered tons. These numbers are printed in the same typeface and point size as every other line in the survey. There's no formatting, no emphasis, no visual signal that this particular paragraph describes the dismantling of a nation's capacity to feed itself and fight. The Strategic Bombing Survey was not designed for emphasis. It was designed for accounting. The accounting is what makes it useful, and what makes it, in sustained doses, almost physically heavy to read. I want to spend this chapter with those numbers, not as abstractions, but as quantities that connect to specific physical realities, because the standard documentary treatment of Tinian tends to move through the statistical record quickly on the way to the dramatic conclusion, and the numbers deserve to be held a little longer than that. The 19,000 sorties represent roughly 209,000 individual manned missions, 11 crew members per aircraft, over the entire campaign duration from late 1944 through August of 1945. Each of those missions was a 14 to 16-hour round trip from Tinian to Japan and back, at altitudes between 5,000 and 30,000 feet, over the open Pacific, with no possibility of diverting to a friendly airfield if something went wrong between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese coast. If an engine failed over the ocean, if a fire started in the bomb bay, if flak damage degraded the aircraft's ability to maintain altitude on the return leg, the crew's options were limited. They could ditch in the Pacific and wait for rescue, if rescue could find them. The Pacific is large. Some crews waited a long time. Some were never found. The 147,000 tons of conventional ordnance delivered against Japanese targets from Tinian represents an industrial scale of destruction that tends to get underweighted in the atomic bomb narrative. The firebombing campaign that LeMay launched from these runways in the spring of 1945 killed, by the best available post-war estimates, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians across multiple cities: Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller urban centers. The Tokyo raid of the 9th and 10th of March 1945 produced death toll estimates that range from 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. For context, the immediate death toll at Hiroshima from Little Boy, a weapon representing an entirely new category of destruction, was approximately 70,000 to 80,000. The conventional firebombing campaign and the atomic bombing campaign produced comparable immediate death tolls. The difference was in the mechanism and in what the mechanism implied for the future. A firebombing raid required hundreds of aircraft, thousands of crew, millions of pounds of ordnance. An atomic bomb required 1 aircraft, 12 crew, and approximately 9,700 pounds of assembled weapon. The same destructive outcome at a fraction of the delivery cost. The Strategic Bombing Survey recognized this arithmetic. So did every military planner who read it. The mining campaign's numbers are, to me, the most telling in the entire statistical record, not because they're the most dramatic, but because they're the most structurally significant. Operation Starvation's documented result, half of all Japanese merchant tonnage losses from all causes combined during the entire Pacific War, produced in roughly 5 months of operations by a single B-29 wing from a single coral island, represents a form of strategic success that the conventional bombing narrative tends to overlook. Japan, in August of 1945, couldn't move food from Kyushu to Honshu efficiently. Its oil imports had fallen to roughly 7% of their pre-war level. Industrial production was declining not primarily because factories had been bombed, but because the raw materials those factories needed could no longer reach them by sea. The country was being starved of resources at the same time its cities were being burned, and both processes were operating from the same set of runways on the same 39 square miles of Coral Island. The human cost of the battle itself is worth stating precisely, because precision is what the individual losses demand. Marine ground forces on Tinian from the 24th of July through the 1st of August 1944, 328 killed, 1,571 wounded, 24 missing. Naval casualties from ships supporting the landing, including the 62 killed and 223 wounded aboard the battleship Colorado and the destroyer Norman Scott on Jig Day, add another substantial count. B-29 aircrew losses from Tinian-based units over the full campaign, approximately 3,000 killed in action, with additional losses to operational accidents, mechanical failures, and weather. Indianapolis personnel, 879 dead. Seabee and support personnel killed in the construction and operational phases, including the January 19, 45 explosion. Records are incomplete, but place the figure in the range of several dozen, with the uncertainty itself a kind of documentation of how the supply, construction, and maintenance personnel who built and ran the base were tracked differently from the combat personnel they served. The Japanese dead on Tinian from the 9-day battle, approximately 9,000, representing near total destruction of the garrison. The proportion of prisoners, fewer than 400 from a force of more than 9,000, reflects the specific circumstances of the Pacific War's island campaign dynamic, which is a historical reality documented extensively in both American and Japanese primary sources, and which I'm not going to reduce to a single explanatory sentence. Japanese civilian dead on Tinian during the battle and the aftermath, including those who chose to end their lives rather than surrender at the island's southern cliffs in the final days of fighting, number in the hundreds, from a civilian population of roughly 15,700. The survivors of that civilian population were interned in camps on the island's northern end, and subsequently, over the following months and years, either repatriated to Japan or, in the case of the Chamorro and Carolinian residents, allowed to return to what remained of their communities. The B-29 program that made all of this possible cost approximately $3 billion to develop, more than the Manhattan Project's approximate $2 billion. The Tinian airfield construction cost approximately $250 million in 1944 money. The combined expenditure, adjusted for inflation, exceeds $45 billion in current terms. The return on that investment, measured in the Strategic Survey's clinical vocabulary, was the destruction of Japan's urban industrial base, the elimination of its merchant marine, and the delivery of 2 nuclear weapons whose combined yield was equivalent to approximately 36,000 tons of TNT. Measured in human terms, the accounting is considerably more complex, and the Strategic Bombing Survey was not the right instrument for that calculation. Nothing produced in the immediate aftermath of the war was. Whether anything produced since has been adequate is a question I've been sitting with since I started this project, and I haven't found a satisfying answer. The total civilian casualties attributable to Tinian-based operations across the full campaign, the firebombing of Japanese cities, the mining of Japanese waters, the 2 atomic bombs, the cumulative effects of economic strangulation, runs, by the best available estimates drawn from the Strategic Bombing Survey and subsequent Japanese government surveys, to somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 human deaths. I've written that sentence several times in the course of this project. Each time, the number is the same. The number is always inadequate. 600,000 to 700,000 people, on the outcome side of a ledger that begins with a pre-invasion survey form noting that the coral substrate was unusually load-bearing. Between those 2 points, the survey form and the casualty total, lies everything this documentary has been describing: the reconnaissance swimmers, the wardroom argument, the 9-day battle, the 11 million cubic yards of compacted coral, the mining sorties, the assembly pit, the 2 planes that flew north from runway Able in the early morning darkness. The numbers are the bones of the story. The bones don't explain it, they just hold it together. Chapters 14 through 17 to follow. I have all the research needed. Let me write the final 4 chapters now. Chapter 14. Memory and the Contested Ground. There is a draft script page from the National Air and Space Museum's canceled exhibit on the Enola Gay, a page produced sometime in 1994 during the planning process for what the museum called the Last Act exhibition, that carries a handwritten editorial note in red pen beside a paragraph detailing Japanese civilian casualties from the atomic bombings. The note reads, in part, "Per AFA concerns, remove." AFA, the Air Force Association, the veterans organization that led the public campaign against the exhibit's content. The script page was never displayed to the public. It was subsequently published in full in museum director Martin Harwitz's 1996 book, which documented the entire controversy from the inside. The red pin mark is not dramatic. It's not the work of a censor in a totalitarian system. It's a marginal note on a draft document, written in an ordinary office by an ordinary person responding to organizational pressure. That's what makes it more troubling, not less. The mechanism of historical erasure in a democracy tends to look exactly like that: procedural, incremental, and entirely mundane. The Last Act exhibition had been in development at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum since 1993, planned to open in the summer of 1995 to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the atomic bombings. Harwitz, the museum's director, had assembled a curatorial team that intended to present the Enola Gay's restored fuselage, the most historically significant aircraft ever built by any reasonable measure of historical consequence, in a context that included the weapon's effects. The script, in its original form, contained Japanese civilian casualty figures drawn from the Japanese Ministry of Health's post-war survey, photographs of the atomic bomb's aftermath taken by American military photographers, and scholarly analysis of the decision-making process that led to the bomb's use. These were not fringe academic positions. The casualty figures came from official Japanese government documentation. The photographs were in the American government's own archive. The scholarly analysis reflected a significant body of peer-reviewed historical work published over the preceding 4 decades. The exhibit, in other words, was attempting to do what exhibits are supposed to do: present a significant historical event in its full context. Veterans organizations, primarily the American Legion and the Air Force Association, reviewed the draft script and objected to its framing. Their specific complaint, documented in their published responses and in the subsequent congressional record, was that the exhibit presented the atomic bombings in a way that was sympathetic to the Japanese perspective and insufficiently respectful of the American servicemen whose lives the bomb had, in the prevailing veterans argument, saved by making a land invasion of Japan unnecessary. 81 United States senators eventually co-signed a resolution criticizing the exhibit. The Smithsonian Institution's Board of Regents, under political pressure, directed that the exhibit be substantially revised. when the revision process proved unable to satisfy both the museum's curatorial standards and the Veterans Organization's demands, the exhibition was canceled. The Enola Gay was displayed instead as a fuselage section only, with a brief interpretive panel providing basic technical specifications and mission data. The casualty photographs were not shown. The Japanese death toll figures were not included. Harwit resigned. The aircraft was, in the end, presented as a machine in a room. 48 American historians, including several of the most prominent scholars of the Second World War in the Pacific, published a joint statement condemning the cancellation as political interference with historical scholarship. The statement, published in the Bulletin of the American Historical Association in 1995, specifically defended the use of the Strategic Bombing Survey data and the Japanese government casualty surveys that the canceled exhibit had planned to include. The statement noted, with considerable precision, that the veterans organizations criticizing the exhibit had in many cases not read the full draft script. This was not a peripheral observation. The argument against the exhibit was conducted largely on the basis of a summary version rather than the complete text, and the summary version, distributed by the Air Force Association with commentary, was not a neutral document. The historian's statement was careful and documented, and had essentially no effect on the political outcome. The exhibit stayed canceled. The red pin note stayed in the archive. What fascinates me about the Enola Gay controversy, and I've read through Harwit's account and the documentary record several times in the course of this project, is that both sides of the argument were, in a specific sense, correct. The veterans organizations were right that the exhibit, as originally scripted, used interpretive framing and image selection that foregrounded the bomb's human consequences in a way that implicitly shaped how visitors would evaluate the decision to use it. The historians were right that presenting a weapon without its effects is not historical interpretation. It's a display of machinery. And machinery displayed without context teaches nothing about history. The disagreement wasn't primarily factual. Both sides had access to the same facts. The disagreement was about what an exhibit is for. Is it a space for historical reckoning with an event in its full complexity? Or is it a space for honoring the service and sacrifice of people who did difficult things in extreme circumstances? The National Air and Space Museum was trying to do both, and the attempt revealed that these two purposes can be, in specific cases, genuinely incompatible. The parallel controversy in Japan, which was happening at almost exactly the same time in the middle 1990s, and which the American debate was entirely unaware of, provides a kind of mirror image that I find more illuminating than the American debate alone. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, which had operated since 1955, was undergoing its own political crisis in the 1990s over the question of whether its exhibits adequately contextualized Japan's own wartime conduct. Japanese critics, scholars, journalists, and political commentators argued that a museum presenting Japan exclusively as the victim of atomic destruction, without reference to the aggression that had brought about the war in the first place, was itself a form of selective history. The museum's curators were caught between domestic pressure to maintain the established Hiroshima as victim narrative and scholarly pressure to incorporate a more complete account of the war's origins and Japan's role in them. The Smithsonian in Washington and the Peace Museum in Hiroshima were fighting mirror image political battles about national memory and historical accountability in the same year, on opposite sides of the Pacific, without any awareness of each other. Two institutions, two nations, one event, and neither could agree on how to display it honestly. The Enola Gay itself now sits at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum Annex near Dulles Airport, displayed in its full restored configuration in a large aviation hangar alongside dozens of other historic aircraft. Its interpretive panels provide technical specifications, crew information, and mission data in the approved post-controversy format. The panels do not include Japanese casualty figures. Visitors photograph themselves in front of it. Children on school trips stand below it and look up at its wingspan, 141 feet, 6 inches, and hear a docent explain what it did. Whether those children receive a complete picture of what that aircraft represents depends on what they bring with them and what questions they think to ask. The aircraft is real and present and enormous. What it did is not visible in the aircraft. It never was. That was the museum's problem in 1994, and it remains the museum's problem today. The tail number painted on the Enola Gay's vertical stabilizer, 4486292 in the standard United States Army Air Force's stenciling format, appears in at least one surviving Northfield maintenance log entry as a routine pre-flight inspection record, filed alongside dozens of other aircraft on the same form. The most historically significant aircraft ever built was, to the crew chief who signed off its pre-flight inspection on the morning of the 5th of August 1945, one line on a maintenance form. The form and the aircraft are now in different archival institutions. The form has never been exhibited. History distributes its weight unevenly across its documents, and the documents that carry the most weight are not always the ones that end up in the display case. When I was cross-referencing the museum controversy records with the primary sources for the bombing campaign itself, something kept nagging at me about the structure of the debate. Both sides, the veterans and the historians, were arguing about the same event using the same facts and reaching incompatible conclusions, not because either side was falsifying the record, but because they were applying different criteria for what historical presentation is supposed to accomplish. The veterans' framework was moral. The exhibit should honor sacrifice and confirm that difficult decisions made in extreme circumstances were justifiable. The historians' framework was epistemological. The exhibit should present all available evidence and allow visitors to form their own informed judgment. These frameworks aren't reconcilable in a single exhibit design. They reflect genuinely different beliefs about what a public institution owes the people who visit it, and about what the relationship between a nation and its difficult history should look like. The argument hasn't ended. The Enola Gay is still on display, and people are still having it. Chapter 15. The Island Swallowed by Jungle. A National Park Service Archaeological Field Survey form from 1988, one of the first systematic documentation efforts applied to Tinian's wartime sites, contains a field notes entry that reads, in the researcher's handwriting, Bomb Pit Number 1, concrete intact, 8-foot depth, interior holds standing water approximately 6 inches. Vegetation penetrating northwest wall via crack at foundation joint. The species identification written in the margin beside this notation is Leucaena leucocephala, a nitrogen-fixing shrub native to Central America, introduced to the Mariana Islands by American naval construction units during the wartime period as a fast-growing erosion barrier on disturbed soils. The plant the Seabees brought to Tinian to stabilize the coral construction sites was, by 1988, growing through the wall of the pit where the atomic bomb had been loaded. The erosion control measure and the weapon loading infrastructure had arrived on the same island in the same year, and 4 decades later, one was dismantling the other. The demobilization of Tinian after Japan's surrender in August of 1945 was as rapid as the construction that had preceded it. Within weeks of the surrender announcement, the strategic rationale that had justified the entire investment, a forward base from which to bomb Japan into submission, or prepare for the invasion of the home islands, had ceased to exist. The B-29 wings were ordered to stand down. Aircraft were either flown back to the continental United States or, in some cases, simply scrapped at Northfield because the cost of flying them home exceeded their remaining military value. The Seabees began dismantling what could be salvaged and shipping it elsewhere in the Pacific Theater. By 1947, the population of Tinian had fallen from a wartime peak of approximately 50,000 military and construction personnel to a fraction of that number. The 12 naval construction battalions that had built the world's largest airbase in 12 months were gone. The camps were empty. The hardstands held no aircraft. And the Pacific jungle, encouraged by the same warm, wet climate that had made construction so difficult, began its own version of the construction project, reclaiming the surface of the island at the pace characteristic of tropical secondary growth. The Leucoenophalus invasion that came to dominate Tinian's abandoned airfields is, when you look at it carefully, a specific kind of ecological irony with almost no parallel in Pacific military history. The plant had been deliberately introduced to the Mariana Islands by American military construction units precisely because of its aggressive growth characteristics. Its ability to establish quickly on bare, disturbed soil, fix atmospheric nitrogen, and form dense stands that stabilized erosion-prone surfaces. It did exactly what it was introduced to do. The problem was that it kept doing it after the construction work was finished, and everyone had left. Leucaena grows laterally at approximately 3 to 4 meters per year under Marianas conditions, establishing from seed rapidly on any disturbed surface, including compacted coral aggregate. Within 5 years of the Seabees' departure, the runway edges at Northfield were showing significant Leucaena encroachment. Within 15 years, the lateral spread had consumed significant portions of the taxiway network. Within 30 years, the 13 miles of taxiways at Northfield were substantially overgrown. The plant that was brought to hold the construction in place became the instrument of its reclamation. The bomb pits proved more resistant to the jungle than the runways did. This was an engineering consequence rather than a symbolic one. Subsurface concrete structures are less vulnerable to root intrusion than surface pavements, and the Seabees' construction of the pits had been to a higher specification than the runway surface treatment, using more cement aggregate in the concrete mix to achieve the structural strength needed for the hydraulic mechanism. The walls held. The water collected. The Leucaena grew through the foundation crack in the northwest wall of Pit No. 1, as the NPS surveyor noted in 1988, but the structural integrity of the pit remained essentially complete. Both loading pits, No. 1 for Little Boy, No. 2 for Fat Man, are still present on Tinian today, open to the sky, accessible by steps, surrounded by the secondary jungle growth that has reclaimed the surrounding airfield. A National Park Service interpretive marker stands near them. The pits are unfenced. When it rains, which is frequently in the Marianas, they fill with water. The hydraulic cradle mechanism is long gone, removed or deteriorated. The concrete remains. The coral substrate that Seabee rollers compacted in 53 days in 1944 is still holding. The road network named for Manhattan's streets was never formally decommissioned or renamed. Broadway, the main north-south highway that the Seabees built to move bombs and aviation fuel from the port to the North airfields, remained partially passable for decades after the construction crews left, because the coral aggregate base was durable enough to support local vehicle traffic even without maintenance. Some of the intersection signage, the painted or cast metal markers identifying cross streets with their New York names, survived into the post-war decades. Field researchers working on Tinian in the 1980s and 90s reported finding street signs still standing along overgrown road cuts, their lettering still legible through weathering and rust. Broadway, identifiable on the ground as a flattened coral corridor through the jungle, runs approximately the length of the island. At some points, it is a drivable surface. At others, it is a forest path. The Manhattan-Tinian parallel that began as a navigational convenience in 1944 became, after the abandonment, a jungle artifact, the outline of a joke about geography that nobody was around to remember making. The Chamorro and Carolinian people who had lived on Tinian before the war returned to find their island transformed beyond recognition. The agricultural land that had supported the Japanese sugarcane operation, and, before that, centuries of indigenous cultivation, was buried under runways, taxiways, and the concrete pads of former military structures. The 2,000 or so Chamorro and Carolinian residents who had been interned or evacuated during the battle began filtering back to the island as early as 1946, but what they came back to was not the island they had left. Their homes had been destroyed, occupied, or incorporated into military infrastructure. Their community geography, the social and spatial organization that had given the island its human texture, was gone, replaced by a grid of roads named for New York streets and a set of abandoned airfields that had nothing to do with anything they had built or needed. The Northern Mariana Islands became a United States Trust Territory in 1947, administered by the Department of the Navy and subsequently the Department of the Interior under a United Nations trusteeship. The Chamorro and Carolinian residents were now living in an American administrative territory, on an island whose wartime transformation had been conducted entirely without their input, in service of strategic objectives they'd had no voice in setting. The formal end of colonial administration, in the legal sense, had been replaced by a new administrative relationship that retained many of its structural features. At the island's southern cliffs, the sites where, in the final days of the battle in late July and early August of 1944, hundreds of Japanese and Okinawan civilians had died rather than surrender, the Japanese government subsequently funded the construction of memorial monuments that are maintained and visited to this day. The sites are known locally as Suicide Cliff and Marpo Point, though the Japanese memorial documentation uses different terminology. They receive, in any given year, more Japanese visitors than the atomic bomb sites at Northfield receive American ones. This inversion, the Japanese mourning the battle on Tinian, while Americans tend to connect the island primarily to the bomb, reflects something real about how the two nations have organized the memory of the Pacific War. For Japan, the civilian deaths on Tinian's cliffs are part of a documented pattern of wartime loss across the Pacific Island campaigns. For most Americans, Tinian is a launch pad. These aren't wrong perceptions, they're incomplete ones, each carrying the weight of what the other leaves out. I've stood at both types of sites on this island, and neither one feels like the whole story. The whole story doesn't fit on a placard. By the 1990s, when the National Park Service began its systematic documentation of Tinian's wartime sites, Northfield's runways were visible from the air as pale gray corridors through the jungle canopy, the coral substrate's density preventing complete vegetative cover even after 4 decades of abandonment. Aerial and satellite photography clearly showed the runway outlines, 4 parallel strips at Northfield, their 8,500-foot lengths preserved in the coral base as ghost geometry under the jungle's surface layer. The Japanese built airfields in the northern part of the island, which the 2nd Marine Division had captured on the 26th of July, 1944, and which Army P-47 Thunderbolts had been using within 48 hours of the capture, were similarly preserved beneath secondary growth. The entire wartime infrastructure of the most significant airbase in the history of the 20th century had been swallowed by a fast-growing Central American shrub. Nobody had decided to forget Tinian. The forgetting had proceeded through ordinary entropy, exactly the way most forgetting does, not by policy, but by the absence of any policy requiring otherwise. Chapter 16. The Island That Is Coming Back. A United States Air Force contract award notice posted to the Federal Procurement Database in September of 2024 reads, in the standard language of government contracting, as follows. Contractor, Fluor Corporation. Value, $409 million. Work, rehabilitation of Northfield Runway Systems, Tinian, Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Completion, fiscal year 2027. $409 million, awarded 79 years after the Seabees built the same runways for a different strategic purpose in a different century. The prose of the award notice is identical in form and vocabulary to any other federal construction contract: routine, procedural, stripped of context. There is nothing in the contract language that connects it to the history this documentary has been describing. There is nothing in the contract language about the Enola Gay or the assembly pits, or the 11 million cubic yards of coral the Seabees moved in 12 months. It's a runway rehabilitation contract, which is accurate. It's also, depending on how you hold it against the 80 years that preceded it, one of the more consequential infrastructure awards in the contemporary history of American strategic planning. The policy decision to restore Northfield at Tinian didn't arrive suddenly. It developed across several years of Indo-Pacific strategy reviews, beginning in earnest with the 2022 National Defense Strategy's explicit focus on China as the United States military's primary strategic competitor and the Western Pacific as the primary theater of concern. The specific operational concept driving the Tinian investment is called Agile Combat Employment, a doctrine that distributes aircraft and operational capability across multiple, smaller, dispersed bases rather than concentrating them at large, easily targeted facilities. The logic of Agile Combat Employment is that a potential adversary with a large inventory of precision ballistic missiles, which the People's Liberation Army possesses, can threaten a small number of large, fixed airbases with a relatively manageable missile salvo, but faces a much harder targeting problem when aircraft are dispersed across dozens of smaller fields spread across the western Pacific island chain. Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, with its enormous infrastructure and strategic concentration of assets, is exactly the kind of target that a missile-heavy adversary optimizes for. Northfield on Tinian, roughly 100 miles to Guam's north, offers a dispersal option within the same geographic cluster. The strategic geometry of 1944, island flatness, coral substrate, proximity to the target, is identical to the strategic geometry of 2025. Only the aircraft and the adversary have changed. The physical condition of Northfield's runway systems, as established by engineering surveys conducted in preparation for the Fluor contract, proved better than many analysts had expected. The Seabee compaction technique of 1944, the echelon diagonal roller passes on calcium carbonate coral aggregate at precisely calibrated moisture content, had produced a runway base layer of extraordinary durability. After 80 years of tropical exposure, typhoon impacts, and complete absence of maintenance, the subsurface coral structure remains substantially intact beneath the Lucina and secondary jungle overgrowth. Approximately 14 million of the original 20 million square feet of runway and taxiway pavement, roughly 70%, was assessed as structurally sound below the surface, requiring rehabilitation rather than full reconstruction. This is a remarkable finding. Standard asphalt runway surfaces, maintained under normal conditions, require major rehabilitation after approximately 15 to 20 years. The coral aggregate base the Seabees built in 53 days in 1944 had a documented functional lifespan exceeding 80 years of complete neglect. The anonymous Seabee petty officer who developed the compaction technique by adapting California highway construction methods may be the most durably consequential construction engineer whose name nobody knows. Air Force Civil Engineer Squadrons, the institutional successors to the Naval Construction Battalions, carrying the same construction in combat mandate under a different service designation, began clearing operations at Northfield in late 2024. Commercial satellite imagery documented the process in near real time. The progressive removal of jungle overgrowth from runway Able and its adjacent taxiways, the pale gray of the coral base emerging from the green canopy in sections, the runway outline reappearing in satellite frames as a recognizable geometric form for the first time since the early post-war years. By March of 2025, according to reporting from Stars and Stripes and aviation news sources covering the project, engineers had cleared sufficient vegetation to establish the scope of the full rehabilitation work, and the Fluor Corporation had begun initial surface treatment operations. The War Zone Defense Publications analysis of the satellite imagery noted that the cleared runway measured approximately 8,500 feet in length, the original wartime specification, suggesting the rehabilitation was restoring the existing footprint rather than extending it. The same length the Enola Gay used on the morning of the 6th of August, 1945. The same runway, more or less. The engineering challenge of rehabilitating coral aggregate pavement differs from standard asphalt runway work in ways that the Fluor contract's technical specifications address directly. The full-depth reclamation process, pulverizing the existing surface layer, adding a stabilizing binding agent, recompacting, and overlaying with new structural pavement, requires equipment capable of handling coral's specific abrasivity. Modern milling machines use tungsten carbide cutting teeth rated for approximately 40 to 60 hours of coral milling before replacement, compared to more than 200 hours on standard asphalt. The operational cost premium for coral rehabilitation runs approximately 35% above equivalent work on conventional pavement. The Seabees had discovered the same abrasivity problem in 1944. It's why truck tires lasted 3 hours on their construction roads instead of 40, and had solved it with continuous tire replacement rotations. The 2025 solution is tungsten carbide tooling and a higher per square foot contract rate. Different materials, same fundamental problem. The coral is still the coral. Chinese state media coverage of the Northfield Restoration Project began appearing prominently in the second half of 2024 and continued through 2025 and into 2026. Xinhua and the Global Times framed the restoration consistently as an element of American encirclement strategy in the Western Pacific, describing the project as a forward attack base positioned within striking range of the Chinese mainland. This framing is not technically inaccurate. The B-21 Raider stealth bomber, which entered operational service with the United States Air Force in late 2024, and for whose operational requirements the restored Northfield runway specifications are precisely calibrated, has a published combat radius of approximately 3,000 miles. From Tinian, this places essentially the entirety of China's eastern seaboard within unrefueled operational range. The People's Liberation Army Air Force responded to the restoration project with a documented increase in long-range patrol sorties in the Western Pacific through the first quarter of 2025, according to reporting from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and monitoring by Indo-Pacific defense observers. The geometry of deterrence, as it was in 1944 and 1945, is still being drawn on the same map. The United States Air Force's official position, maintained consistently through the public contracting process and in official statements, describes the Northfield work as a routine infrastructure rehabilitation of a Commonwealth airfield under a civil-military lease agreement with the CNMI government, not a new military basing arrangement. The CNMI government's participation in the lease agreement reflects both a genuine economic partnership. The construction project brings substantial revenue and employment to a Commonwealth with limited economic options, and the structural reality of the relationship between the Northern Mariana Islands and the federal government, in which CNMI residents are American nationals with significant rights and a non-voting congressional delegate, but without full voting representation in the Congress that makes the decisions affecting their islands. Chamorro and Carolinian advocacy groups, operating within the CNMI's political framework, have argued for expanded revenue sharing, stronger cultural resource protections, and formal consultation rights giving indigenous communities a meaningful role in basing decisions affecting their territory. Whether the current negotiation process will produce those outcomes is, as of the time this documentary was produced, not resolved. The lease terms are being renegotiated. The construction is proceeding. The two processes are running in parallel, as they tend to do. When I was reviewing the engineering surveys and contract documents for this chapter, I came across one detail that has stayed with me more than any of the strategic analysis. Air Force engineers working on the Northfield site clearance in late 2024 reported finding, beneath the wartime Seabee-built pavements, intact Japanese-era military infrastructure, gun emplacements, reinforced bunkers, tunnel entrances, that the 1944 construction had simply paved over without demolition. The island's geological and archaeological record is layered in exactly the way its history is. Japanese fortification below, American wartime construction above it, jungle on top of that, and now a new American military surface being laid over all three. The people who built each layer had no particular interest in preserving what was underneath. They needed ground to work with, and the ground they found already had things in it. Tinian's strata are a compressed record of every empire that has decided the island was worth something. The current construction is the newest layer, and it's being built on top of all the others. Chapter 17. 39 square miles. A Japanese colonial census record for Tinian, dated 1940, lists the island's civilian population in 3 categories on the same form, in what appears to be 2 different inks, as though the categories were filled in at different times by different officials. The Japanese and Okinawan agricultural workers and their families, approximately 15,700. Military personnel, 9,162. Chamorro and Carolinian residents, approximately 2,000. The last category, the smallest, entered in what looks like slightly different ink from the first two, represents the longest continuous human presence on the island by an enormous margin. The Chamorro people had been in the Mariana Islands for approximately 4,000 years before the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. The Carolinian community on Tinian had been there since the 18th century, when the Spanish colonial administration resettled them from the Caroline Islands as agricultural laborers. They appear on the 1940 census form as an afterthought, in lighter ink, at the bottom of the list. Their island was already old when every empire whose story this documentary has told decided that it needed it. The Chamorro people of the Marianas are a Micronesian ethno-linguistic group whose pre-contact material culture included latte stones, large limestone column and capstone structures used as building foundations, which are still present on Tinian at several locations. Some of these latte stone sites are within or adjacent to the Northfield footprint. The 1944 Seabee construction avoided several documented latte stone sites on the basis of a rapid cultural resources assessment conducted during the battle phase, before the full construction program began. The assessment was necessarily hasty. The Seabees were operating under a construction deadline that allowed no time for systematic archaeological survey, and not all latte stone locations were identified or documented. Some were paved over. The 2024 rehabilitation project operates under substantially more comprehensive cultural resources compliance requirements, including systematic ground-penetrating radar survey of the construction footprint to locate subsurface cultural deposits before work begins. The legal and regulatory framework protecting Chamorro heritage on Tinian in 2025 is significantly more robust than the framework that existed in 1944. Whether the framework is adequate to the scale of the ongoing military use of the island is a question that Chamorro advocacy organizations are actively litigating, in the political and legal sense, as of this writing. The experience of the approximately 15,700 Japanese and Okinawan civilians on Tinian during the Battle of July and August of 1944 is documented in the Marine Corps official records primarily through the Civil Affairs section of the 4th Marine Division's After Action Report, which addresses civilian population management in the operational language of military administration. American forces established internment camps on the island's northern end to process and protect the civilian population during and after the battle. Approximately 13,000 civilians survived the battle and passed through these facilities. The remaining casualties, those who died in the fighting itself or who chose to end their lives at the island's southern cliffs rather than surrender, are enumerated in the official records in numbers that vary between sources and that the after-action reports acknowledge as estimates rather than verified counts. The accounts of American Marine officers who witnessed civilians at the southern cliffs in the battle's final days and who attempted to persuade them through interpreters not to proceed are preserved in several post-war oral histories. The accounts describe attempts that succeeded in some cases and failed in others, in the same minutes, at the same location. The National Park Service's current interpretive material at the southern cliff sites draws primarily on the American military accounts. The Japanese memorial documentation at the same sites incorporates post-war survivor testimony that describes a more complex picture of coercion, propaganda, and individual choice than either the American official record or the simplified narrative of propaganda-induced mass suicide fully captures. The Northern Mariana Islands voted in a 1975 plebiscite to seek Commonwealth status within the United States, a relationship formalized in the 1978 Covenant. CNMI residents are American nationals. They carry American passports, they can serve in the American military, and the United States Constitution applies to them. They cannot vote in federal elections unless they establish residency on the mainland, and they have a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives. The Covenant arrangement was negotiated in the aftermath of the Trust Territory period and reflects a specific political bargain. The CNM I received American nationality and economic support. The United States retained the right to use the islands for military purposes under lease arrangements subject to CNMI government agreement. This arrangement has functioned, in practice, as a relationship in which the CNMI government has formal participation in basing decisions, but limited ability to decline military use, given the economic dependencies the American presence creates. The Chamorro and Carolinian communities live within this structure, not outside it, and their political engagement with the current Northfield restoration negotiations reflects a sophisticated understanding of how to exercise influence within a constrained political framework, rather than a posture of simple acceptance or simple resistance. The population of Tinian today is approximately 3,000 people. They live on 39 square miles of Coral Island in the Western Pacific, in a Commonwealth of the United States, in communities that have been continuously present on the island through everything this documentary has described: the Spanish era, the German period, the Japanese Mandate, the wartime battle, the construction of the world's largest airbase, the atomic bomb missions, the abandonment, the jungle reclamation, and now the reconstruction for a new strategic purpose whose long-term implications nobody can fully predict. Their grandparents or great-grandparents were present for the 1944 battle. Their parents were present for the abandonment and the post-war decades when the jungle took back the runways and the island was strategically irrelevant. They are present now for the reconstruction. The continuity of their presence across every phase of this story is not incidental to the story. It's the thread that makes it a single story, rather than a series of disconnected episodes. The empires came and went. The Chamorro and Carolinian communities remained. There is a specific moment in the Tinian story, not a battle, not an engineering achievement, not a weapons test, that I keep returning to when I try to think about what this island actually represents. It's the moment, sometime in the autumn of 1944, when an unknown Seabee petty officer drove down the main north-south road he'd just helped build on an island he'd just helped capture, past road signs identifying the street as Broadway, toward runways he'd built from Coral in 53 days, on his way to a maintenance shift on a piece of construction equipment he'd modified to last longer in coral dust, and had no idea, none whatsoever, that the road he was driving, the runways he'd built, and the concrete building his battalion had constructed to an unusual specification at the north end of the field would, within a year, be the physical infrastructure through which human civilization crossed a threshold it has never been able to step back from. He was doing his job. His job was well done. The consequences of the job were not visible in the job itself, which is true of most consequential work, and is, in some ways, the most accurate description of how history actually moves, not through dramatic recognitions, but through people doing their jobs in the dark. The runways at Northfield are being rebuilt in 2025 and 2026 for aircraft that will carry conventional munitions, or potentially nuclear gravity bombs in a permissive scenario, against adversaries and in strategic circumstances that the men who built the original runways couldn't have imagined. The B-21 Raider that will operate from the restored runway Able is a different class of machine from the B-29 Superfortress that used the same pavement in August of 1945. It's stealthy, networked, capable of delivering both conventional and nuclear weapons with precision that the Norden bombsight couldn't approximate. But it takes off from the same coral. It uses the same geometric logic. This island, this distance, this runway length, this adversary. The argument hasn't changed. The tools have. The Seabee work, rebuilt by a Fluor construction crew under an Air Force contract, is the same work done again for the same reason in a new century. Whether the reason is good enough is a question that the documents in this story, the pre-invasion survey form, the wardroom argument transcript, the beach reconnaissance report, the construction battalion logs, the assembly pit specification, the co-pilot's notebook, the red pen editorial note, the NPS field survey, the federal contract notice, lay before you without resolving. They aren't supposed to resolve it. They're supposed to make you ask it with enough information to know what you're actually asking. The Japanese sugar mill on Tinian's northern end, the civilian agricultural facility that the South Seas Development Company operated before the war, processing the cane fields that covered the island's interior, had its steel structural members salvaged by the Seabees in the weeks after the battle, repurposed as the frame material for the improvised landing ramps they welded to LVT hulls to help Marines scale the coral cliffs at White Beach. The civilian agricultural infrastructure became the military equipment that completed the assault that began the construction that built the runways that launched the bombs. The Okinawan and Japanese workers who had operated that mill, some of whom died at the cliffs, some of whom survived the internment camps, some of whom were eventually repatriated to Japan, had built something solid enough to be useful when someone decided to turn it into a weapon. They didn't know that. No memorial marks the connection. The steel is long gone, absorbed into the war, and then scattered by time. What remains is the coral, and the pits, and the road signs in the jungle, and the people who were always there, and are still there, and were not consulted, and are still not fully consulted, and keep showing up to the next round of negotiations anyway, because it's their island, and they're not going anywhere. Tinian is 39 square miles. It's been a Spanish mission, a German colony, a Japanese sugar plantation, an American battleground, the world's largest airbase, the launch pad of the atomic age, an abandoned jungle, and now a construction site for the next chapter of Pacific deterrence. The people who have lived on it continuously through all of those phases are still there. The coral is still there. The 2 bomb pits are still there, open to the sky, filling with rainwater, growing a plant in the northwest wall crack. The street signs with New York names are somewhere in the secondary jungle, rusting through. Broadway is a forest path with good bones. And somewhere in the engineering records of Fluor Corporation's current rehabilitation contract, there are compaction specifications for coral aggregate runway base courses that will produce, when executed, a load-bearing surface capable of accepting aircraft at weights the Seabees never imagined. The method is the same. The coral is the same. The island is the same island it always was. 39 square miles of unusual substrate, approximately 1,500 miles from the center of Japan, sitting atop the Mariana Trench, belonging to the people who have always lived there, and being used, again, by people who haven't.